JRR Tolkien did not like giving interviews, but in 1961 he sat down with the author and poet Lars Gustafsson, who was interviewing him for the Swedish publication Dagens Nyheter. And in his article, Gustafsson opened it by saying this: "In front of me, a man sits in a room filled to overflowing with books, prints, odds and ends, piles of manuscripts, and Victorian ornaments. His features are so sharp that you might think him a bird of prey, or perhaps some kind of troll. His eyes as well are like those of a bird of prey, the one part of him not aged. Theirs is a quick vigilance, perhaps also suspicion. They shyly flick away or suddenly drill into whatever he is looking at with enormous focus. He speaks in a muffled voice, a pipe constantly in his mouth. Speaking to him makes you nervous. Listening to his words makes you worried. He's a totally unique human being. He could serve as a warning to storytellers taking a step too far, enveloping themselves too deeply within their tale. But he could also serve as a model for everyone wanting to create story. For in his stories you find a concreteness, a hallucinatory clarity, making them enter the dreams of the readers, giving new color to all they see. And yet, they are only fairy tales."
Every human being, across all time and space, we've been hardwired for stories.
There are no breaks in this business. You make your breaks.
The reason I'm in this room right now is because my music's very dope.
Let's try to find something that people remember 20 years later.
Break rules. Leave the world more interesting for your being here. Make good art.
You're only given a little spark of madness. And if you lose that, you're nothing.
To be like the greats, you have to study the greats. And today, we are studying J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and The Silmarillion. Every single episode of Artwell is connected to one that came before it. And so the reason we are studying Tolkien today is because of singer-songwriter Joni Mitchell. Early in her career, she had a Tolkien phase, and she was telling people that her favorite wizard was Gandalf, and she even named her publishing company after him. And so it's because of this that I decided to dive into the world of Tolkien, into Middle-earth for the first time. And in preparation for this episode, I read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. I unfortunately did not have time to read The Silmarillion, but I also read J.R.R. Tolkien, a biography by Humphrey Carpenter. I read The Letters of J.R.R. Tolkien, which was organized by Humphrey Carpenter with assistance from Christopher Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien's son. I watched a film portrait of J.R.R. Tolkien, and I read 11 interviews, taking 431 highlights. And so now I'm very excited to share with you what I learned. My name is Jacob Kelly, and this is Artwell. If I was to ask you what J.R.R. Tolkien's primary art form was, what would you say? You'd probably say something like writing or world building or storytelling. And while Tolkien was incredibly talented at those things, they weren't his primary art form. His primary art form was language. Because before The Lord of the Rings, before The Hobbit, before The Silmarillion, there was Quenya, or the language that came to be known as Quenya. Quenya is one of the two languages spoken by the elves in The Lord of the Rings, and Tolkien started developing it in the early 1910s. And the reason that he started writing this great mythology that he ultimately created was because he had a language and he needed to find the history of that language. He wrote the entire world of The Lord of the Rings backwards from the language. His biographer, Humphrey Carpenter, said he had been working for some time at the language that was influenced by Finnish. And by 1915, he had developed it to a degree of some complexity. He felt that it was a mad hobby, and he scarcely expected to find an audience for it. But he sometimes wrote poems in it, and the more he worked at it, the more he felt that he needed a history to support it. In other words, you cannot have a language without a race of people to speak it. He was perfecting the language. Now he had to decide to whom it belonged. And I love this because, one, I've just never heard of anybody else starting a story from a language that they developed first. But the lesson that I thought about that was like, whenever you think of a story, like the first time you get the idea, you never get the whole story at once. You get a piece of that story, whatever that might be, as your starting point, and then you have to develop the rest of the story from that initial piece. And while Tolkien in this case started with language, he also had periods where The Hobbit started with just a sentence. He was grading papers one day because he was a professor at Oxford. And on the back of one page, there was an empty page. He just looked at it and wrote, "In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit." He didn't know what a hobbit was. He didn't know what any of that meant. He didn't know why the hobbit lived in the ground. But from that sentence, on that one paper he was grading, he wrote an entire book. And so sometimes stories start with a language. Sometimes they start with a sentence. Tolkien often says he likes to have a name. If you give him a name, he can create a whole story around that person. But if he needs that name first. Or even if we look to past episodes of the show when talking about James Cameron, the Terminator, at least the initial Terminator, which has now become a massive franchise, started with a singular image that Cameron had during a fever dream. He was sick in Rome, Italy, and he was in his hotel room trying to sleep and finally fell asleep, and he had a nightmare. And in that nightmare, he saw an image of a metal skeleton coming out of a ball of fire. And it was from that image that he then developed the Terminator. And so every story has a different starting point, but they all start with like a sliver of something, whether it be an image, a language, a name, or even just a sentence. And then you flush the rest of the details out from there. Stephen King talks about writing is this process of archaeology. Like you see that sliver and then you just chip away the dirt that's around it to reveal a little bit more of that story. And then that information allows you to chip away a little bit more and reveal even more of that story. And all you're doing is you're just chipping away and away and away, and the world will slowly reveal itself to you. Because as you go through this process, like if we use Tolkien as the example, like he starts to develop the language, and questions about his world will beget more questions about the world, which will beget more questions about the world. And you can just go and go and go until you've developed this entire world. And so again, using him as the example, it's like, well, he has his language now. Well, who speaks this language? It's not men, it's elves. Okay, so elves speak the language. Okay, but who are these elves? Where do these elves live? What is it like where they live? Who is the leader of the elves? Who is the leader before him? Who's the leader after them? And you just go and go and go. And again, each question you ask and answer about your world begets more and more questions. And that is how you flush out a story. It is piece by piece. It is slowly revealed to you, starting from a very small point. Sometimes it's the language, sometimes it's an image, sometimes it's just a name or a sentence. And so language was Tolkien's primary art form. It was his first love. His mom taught him Latin when he was very young, and that was like the spark that lit the fire. He became so fascinated by languages. He started learning about many different ones. Obviously Latin. He really liked Welsh. He really did not like French. A little bit of Old English, of course. He quite liked Finnish. He liked the way the words sounded aesthetically. It was very pleasing to him, which is a big reason why Quenya was kind of developed out of or has similar sounds to Finnish. This was what he did to express himself. He did paint a little bit. Music, however, didn't really stick with him. Like his mom even tried to get him to learn music, but there was a little success there. Like language was it for him. His biographer said, if he had been interested in music, he would have very likely have wanted to compose melodies. But he wasn't interested in music. He was interested in language. So why should he not make up a personal system of words that would be, as it were, a private symphony? Words were Tolkien's music. He didn't compose songs. He created languages. Even as a child, he would start to put together different languages that only he knew. And long after the publication of The Lord of the Rings, he was giving an interview. And the interviewer asked him why he developed these languages so far in advance of The Lord of the Rings. He was like, for what purpose? Just for fun? And Tolkien's response was expressing one's tastes. After all, isn't that what artists do? And I thought that was an interesting idea. It's like the purpose of an artist is to express one's tastes. And I think how one's worldview also could be, in theory, one's taste. Like your aesthetic preferences are influenced by your experience in this life. And as a result, that is going to influence what your art looks, feels like, and is about. And so I think the purpose of art is to express one's taste, which I think is really interesting, because it is your tastes then that have the ability to influence the world. And so therefore, the ability to articulate one's tastes become even more important. I've been on this train of like, you need to be able to articulate your taste for a while, but this framing, this idea, like when Tolkien said that the purpose of art is to, or what artists do is expressing their tastes, and you're expressing your tastes in your art, which means your art is what is going to change the world. And so if we kind of ladder back from that, that means that your tastes are actually quite important. And the ability to articulate your taste, why you like things, why you don't, is also important. And for Tolkien, the way he expressed himself, the way he expressed his aesthetic preferences, well, of course, eventually made it into his stories, started first with the language. His aesthetic preferences for language shaped Quenya, and Quenya then shaped what the Lord of the Rings ultimately became. And his love of language became his career long before his writing ever did. Like I mentioned, Tolkien was a professor at Oxford. He was a philologist, and philologist is someone who studies philology. And philology comes from the ancient Greek word philologia, which means love of word. And so philology is the study of language in oral and written historical sources. It is the intersection of textual criticism, literary criticism, history, and linguistics, with strong ties to etymology, which is the study of the origin and evolution of words. And so Tolkien was studying, in his case, a lot of historical texts, which was typically mythological texts and fairy stories or fairy tales. And two big ones for him were obviously Beowulf and the Kalevala, which was a Finnish mythology. And so Tolkien spent his days studying the language of great myths. And so not only did the fact that he wrote his own language influence Lord of the Rings, but all he did all day long was study other great myths. His job was to understand the language that exists within mythologies. So he wrote a language he loved and then built a mythology around it. And the key, though, is that while he was studying these great myths, he wasn't trying to recreate them. He was trying to evolve the way myths were told for the time in which he lived. He wasn't trying to write another Beowulf. He was trying to write something new for the 20th century. He wanted to write an English myth that had never existed prior. He was building off of what came before, not retracing its footsteps. And there's this review that C.S. Lewis gave for The Fellowship of the Ring. And C.S. Lewis, of course, was a close personal friend of Tolkien's. But there's something in his review that just stopped me in my tracks that is relevant here to how Tolkien approached building off of the myths that he had learned from when writing The Lord of the Rings. It's a little bit long, but he said, this book is like lightning from a clear sky. To say that in a heroic romance, gorgeous, eloquent, and unashamed, has suddenly returned at a period almost pathological in its anti-romanticism is inadequate. To us who live in that odd period, the return and the sheer relief of it is doubtless the important thing. But in the history of romance itself, a history which stretches back to the Odyssey and beyond, the Lord of the Rings makes, or I guess the Fellowship of the Ring in this case, makes not a return, but an advance or revolution, the conquest of new territory. That line, it makes not a return, but an advance, is the line that I was reading this book, and this was in the biography, and I stopped, and I just stared at those, 7, 8 words, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 words. It makes not a return, but an advance. This is the goal. This is why studying the past is so important. The Lord of the Rings would not have been possible had Tolkien not understood the historical context with which his mythology was going to live within. It is because of his understanding of the past that he was able to innovate and create something new, unlike anything we'd seen before. Your goal when studying the past is not to recreate it. It is not to return to the past, but to advance the past into the present. Tolkien said, in The Lord of the Rings, I have tried to modernize the myths and make them credible. Modernize your influences. I think this is a problem, right? I think not a problem, but you see this often. Like the 20th century, when it comes to art, I say art very broadly. I'm thinking a lot through the lens of film, but like was incredibly influential even to today. And so you see a lot of writers, a lot of filmmakers who are heavily influenced by the 20th century. But the goal, again, is not to recreate your influences, it's to modernize them. How do you bring those things into the 21st century? And not to be the guy who quotes his own essay, especially so early into an episode, but I recently published an essay called How to Be the Greatest in the World, which is what I learned studying the great bass guitarist Jaco Pastorius. And being the greatest in the world kind of fell into three buckets in this essay. One was you needed technical mastery, so your ability to do your craft at an incredibly high level. You needed emotional mastery, the ability to accurately communicate how you are feeling through your art form in a way that the audience can understand, too. But you also needed historical knowledge and understanding. You needed to know what came before you so you had an understanding of what to do next. Because often in art, innovation does not come from doing what has never been done before, but not recreating what has already been done. But when I was talking about the importance of studying the past, and of course that's what this whole show is about, we're studying the past, there is a danger with that. And I said the dangerous thing with the past is it's easy to fall in love with. You can spend your whole life paying tribute to the work that inspired you instead of doing the work that will inspire others. While the past is filled with lots of great work, you can't spend all of your time looking back if you want the future to be filled with great work too. Once you've studied the past, let it go. You'll never become one of the greats if all you ever do is try to be like them. Tolkien wasn't trying to be like Beowulf. He wasn't trying to write a story exactly like the Kalevala. He was trying to take what they've done and build upon it. He was standing on the shoulders of giants who came before him. That is why you want to study the past, to know what it is you need to do to move the art form forward. But if you do want to fall in love with a history of some kind, do not fall in love with the history of our world. Fall in love with the history of your world. And the reason I'm saying this is because Tolkien didn't view the Lord of the Rings and the mythology where it takes place as a story that he was creating. He viewed it as a history that existed that he was essentially just transcribing and sharing with the world. As a matter of fact, his biographer talked about one time he went to visit Tolkien at his house. And he said that Tolkien says that he has to clear up an apparent contradiction in a passage of The Lord of the Rings that has been pointed out in a letter from a reader. The matter requires his urgent consideration as a revised edition of the book is about to go to press. He explains it all in great detail, talking about his book not as a work of fiction, but as a chronicle of actual events. He seems to see himself not as an author who has made a slight error that must now be corrected or explained away, but as a historian who must cast light on obscurity in a historical document. And this might obviously just sound like a biographer who's dramatizing his encounters with this great author. But Tolkien himself actually refers to the Lord of the Rings and the greater mythology it takes place within as a history. In 1961, 7 years after the publication of The Lord of the Rings, he says, "What I have published, you see, is just a part of a much larger tale. It is very long, spanning about 1,000 years. And there are so many stories. My idea is to publish most of it before I die, if anyone is interested in it. As a whole, it makes up a kind of history." And why I think viewing your story as a history matters is because the most important thing for your audience is to feel like the story they are watching or the story they are reading is true. It's real. And the audience will never view your world as real if you don't view it as real. And so you need to treat your story and the world that takes place as something that actually exists. And by doing so, it's going to force your world to have rules and logic that are consistent, that your audience is never questioning the rules of your world. They are just there, they are in it, they believe it. This attention to detail to the world where your story takes place is something we are starting to see pop up consistently amongst history's greatest artists. If we look at 2 episodes we've done already, James Cameron is very, very meticulous about every little detail in the world of Avatar. He can even tell you the types of screws used on the ships you see in the films. George Miller is also the exact same way. Every single thing you see on screen in a George Miller film, the director of Mad Max, has to have some form of explanation. Every single thing must be able to justify its existence and have a reason for being where it is and why it looks the way it does. Otherwise, it does not make it onto the screen. The world must feel lived in, and for a world to feel lived in, it must feel consistent in the rules which guide that world. Even if we think of a more, like, I guess, James Cameron and George Miller are modern, but like a different example in the video gaming world, God of War was the exact same way. They had everything explained, the way things look, the way that they do, all were consistent. And when you do that, the world feels real. And when the world feels real, the audience can just be in that world and believe in your story much more easily. And so if you're treating your story not as a history, but not as a story, but as a history, like what does that actually mean though? I'm going to try to explain this to you. It might get a little bit more woo-woo as we go, but the way Tolkien describes it is he had a sense that he was recording what was already there somewhere, not of inventing. And I think that distinction between recording and inventing is really, really important, because the way Tolkien explains it is like he'll get a flash of inspiration of something and he has to go and uncover this thing. Kind of what we talked about with the language, right? You start with the language that gives you a glimpse into this world and you're just chipping away more and more as it's going to reveal itself to you. It's not what is... And this becomes much more easy when you have a world that has consistent rules. Like these rules you create for your world are kind of going to act as a filter that everything is going to run through. And so while it's easy to say like you are just recording what is happening, not inventing it, you kind of have subconsciously invented the guardrails of your world because you're following your tastes in a way. You're not necessarily coming to a point and being like, oh, this is what I want to have happen next, so therefore that is what's going to happen next. You're going to follow the logical sequence of events based off of the world in which your story takes place. But you are not in control of that history. You are recording it as the inspiration comes to you. It is showing you what is there, and you have to go and find the rest of it. You know, just to give an example of this, so like Tolkien talking about how when he's writing The Lord of the Rings, like he was not creating these things. He was not inventing them. They were being shown to him through flashes of inspiration, or they were appearing as he was writing, as he was following this like logical sequence of event, logical in the context of his world, and things were coming up that he didn't necessarily know. So he wrote that the essential quest started at once, like the quest of the Lord of the Rings. And some of these examples might not mean anything to you if you've never read The Lord of the Rings or watched them. But he said that the essential quest started at once, but I met a lot of things on the way that astonished me. Tom Bombadil I knew already, but I had never been to Bree. Strider sitting in the corner at the inn was a shock, and I had no more idea of who he was than had Frodo. The Mines of Moria had been a mere name, and of Lothlorien no word had reached my mortal ears till I came there. Far away I knew there was the Horse Lords of the on the confines of an ancient kingdom of men, but Fanghorn Forest was an unforeseen adventure. I had never heard of the House of Eorl nor of the Stewards of Gondor. Most disquieting of all, Saruman had never been revealed to me, and I was as mystified as Frodo at Gandalf's failure to appear on September 22nd. Which, in the books, that last example, Frodo leaves on his journey and Gandalf is supposed to meet him, and Gandalf doesn't show up. And so Tolkien is saying here, he had no idea why Gandalf wasn't there, but he knew he wasn't going to be there. And because he was not inventing the story, he was recording it. He couldn't just get to that point, Gandalf's not there, and change it to be like, oh, and Gandalf was there waiting for Frodo. Like once he arrived there in the story and Gandalf wasn't there, that was true to Tolkien. Once the story reveals itself to you, you cannot go in and change it, because that's how you want it to be. That is what I'm trying to explain here when I say you are recording the story, you are not inventing it. You are following the story as it unfolds logically, and it is going to present itself to you in ways in which you do not expect. Even this is a little bit later, and this is a slight, small spoiler to The Lord of the Rings, but while he was writing the book, he was writing letters to his son, Christopher, who was stationed in South Africa during the Second World War. And he was sending him pieces of the story, like in the mail. And he talked about how a new character has come on the scene. I am sure I did not invent him. I did not even want him, though I like him. But there he came walking into the woods of Ithilien, Faramir, the brother of Boromir. It's not like when Tolkien was writing it, he knew that Sam and Frodo were going to get into these woods and then they were going to meet Boromir's brother. They were in the woods. Tolkien wasn't sure what was going to happen next. And then all of a sudden, they meet Faramir. And he's like, who is this guy? And as he starts asking, who is this guy? Where did he come from? Like, it's going to be revealed to him. And I think writing in this way is actually very similar to a way in which like Quentin Tarantino talks about doing something very similar in his stories, where he says like he just lets the characters tell him the story. He's dictating what they're doing. He is not imposing his thoughts and ideas on the characters. He's creating the characters and creating the world, and the characters exist within that. And the reason you're doing that, and it feels woo. I remember when I first heard this, like when I first started like learning about art, especially filmmaking. Because a couple of years ago before I did the show, I was like, I want to learn to screenwrite. And so I started studying movies because I never really watched a ton of movies before. And I remember Tarantino talking about this. He was like, yeah, I'm not creating any of this. Like, this is just happening. And I'm just writing it all down. And I'm like, what does that even mean? Like, what do you mean you're not creating this? Like, but the more and more I kind of go down this rabbit hole of studying these great artists and writing myself, I understand what they're saying. Because I think that there's a screenplay I started working on earlier this year that I have not finished. And I wonder if part of the reason for that, I mean, obviously doing this show takes a lot of work. I have a job, so finding the time to also write is difficult. But part of the reason I wonder is I tried to do a different method of writing where I outlined the entire story in a pretty immense detail. And so I knew exactly where I was going. And so I wasn't necessarily writing a story. I was just filling in the gaps and expanding upon an outline. It was also a story based on a true story, so that's part of the reason why I did the outline. But in doing that, because I wasn't necessarily there was no surprises that were occurring. The story wasn't as exciting to me. Versus in the example of like Tolkien, or if we're talking about Tarantino, like if you're following the story and you're letting the story surprise you as you record it, your audience is going to be surprised as well. Because if you don't know where it's going, the audience won't know where it's going either. Versus if you lay out your story, this is especially prominent in screenwriting, less so with novels, but like in screenwriting, if you try to write super mathematically, where you're like, by page 30, we need to be at the end of Act 1, by page 90, we need to be at the end of Act 2, and then the movie needs to end up by page 120, and then you like fill in your story from that, where it's like you're thinking about it too mathematically of what is like the logical thing to happen, like that can become a little bit too predictable. I think part of the reason we like Tarantino stories, and part of the reason why The Lord of the Rings is so great, is because we don't know where they're going. They take these twists and turns that make sense, but might not necessarily be expected. And it is keeping you on your toes, and therefore it will keep the audience on your toes as well. If the story does not change as you write it, then it is far too obvious. You know, I put together a few quotes of Tolkien's here talking about this, how when he was writing this story, obviously he's being surprised by all of these things that I've just explained to you. But at one point he tried to write the ending of the story far before he had reached there. And he said that several times I tried to write the last scene ahead of time. It didn't come out. It never worked. All I had to do was wait for it to come through. All that I had sketched or written before proved of little use, as times, motives, etc. have all changed. It will probably work out very differently from this plan when it really gets written, as the things seem to write itself once it get going, as if the truth comes out then, only imperfectly glimpsed in the preliminary sketch. And so you might have an idea of where things are going. Obviously, you are the creator of this world. Even though you are recording, you are the creator. And I'm going to get into this notion of subcreation and these secondary worlds, and like why you are, even though you're recording a history, you are still the creator. We're going to get to that. But you might have an idea of where this is going, but the world will reveal itself to you as you write. And again, I think that I know this can feel very woo-woo, which is why I really want to try to like make sure I articulate this point properly of, you are not like, yes, you are writing the story. This story is is yours. You are creating this, of course. But I think really what happens is the ideas you set out with in the beginning of writing your story are going to change, because as you go through the story, as you're writing the story, you start to learn your characters more, you start to learn the world more and the rules that dictate this world where your story takes place. And therefore, the ideas you have in the beginning of writing your story were ideas you had before you learned all of this stuff. So as you're writing your story and you're learning all this about your characters, about the world, by the time you reach, we'll say chapter 7, you realize the idea you had for chapter 7 doesn't actually make sense with when you put it up against all of that you've learned about the world up to that point. And so when you get to chapter 7, it might go left when you thought it was going to go right, because that is the next logical sequence of events in the story based on what you've written up to that point. And all of these ideas that you had in the beginning don't actually hold up when you get there, because you've learned so much about all of these things. And so that's really what I think when people are saying like the story writes itself. It's not that the story writes itself, although that's genuinely what it can feel like when you're writing. But what's happening is you are just getting a deeper understanding of what actually makes sense in this world that you have created. And therefore, you're going to follow this logical path of your world and not what you wanted the world to be. The world will take shape as you write it, and that is what is going to help guide your story. And even though you're putting all of these little details into your world to make sure your world feels consistent and true and real, does not mean you have to give your audience all of the explanations for all of these things that make up your world. Right? Because you're telling a story that takes place in this world. You're not giving a lecture about your world. You're not making a documentary about your world. You are telling a story that takes place in this world. And so any of the little details that are there that are real do not need to be explained if they do not contribute to the story you are telling and the emotion you are trying to convey to the audience. However, by having all of these little details, in addition to making things feel real, they also give more nuggets for your audience to latch onto. The more details that you've filled your world with that the audience can uncover, the more invested they will become. They'll have a sense of ownership over your story, over your world, if they feel like they are uncovering things for themselves. Right? The more someone puts into your story, the more that they should be able to get out of it. And the more they get out of it, the more invested they will become. And I think that's part of the reason why The Lord of the Rings has endured so greatly, is because there is such a great mythology that surrounds the entire story. There are so many entry points and avenues that you can go down. You can spend your whole life studying this world. And there are Tolkien scholars who do this, because of how much there is there for people to uncover. And the more they uncover, the more ownership they have, like I said. Tolkien even acknowledged this. He said part of the attraction of The Lord of the Rings is, I think, due to the glimpses of a large history in the background, an attraction like that of viewing far off an unvisited island, or seeing the towers of a distant city gleaming in a sunlit mist. To go there is to destroy the magic unless new unattainable vistas are again revealed. There's again a couple of readings I have on this quote. One of them is kind of what I was just talking about, where it's like the more that there is there, the more that people can dig into. But what Tolkien is saying there at the end of this quote, where it's like all of this large history feels like the towers of a distant city gleaming in a sunlit mist, is like people are going to let their own imaginations run wild inside of your world. It's like, think about like if you've never been to New York City, or before you ever went to New York City, what you thought New York City wasn't exactly what New York City is. But you had this romance about the city that drew you to it. And there was this romance about Middle Earth of like all of these things that you know is there that you could go and see, or your imagination is going to think about. Like even if like when I was reading The Lord of the Rings, again, I only read the Lord of the Rings, A Hobbit. So I didn't go into like the history of Middle Earth written by Christopher Tolkien or anything like that, or even the Silmarillion. But like he's talking about these armies that come from distant lands, or like an Oliphant. And I'm like, I want to know where these people come from and how'd they get involved and what their journey to get here was like. And it's like putting all these questions in my head that I want to answer about the world that is like drawing me in even further. And so by putting all these details in your world, not only is it making your world feel real, but it is giving so many things to give people either that they can latch onto, they can learn about, and if they make a discovery about your world, like they feel like they did that themselves. And even if they don't put in the work to do the discovery, you've planted all these seeds that give people more and more things to think about your world. Like I want to learn about these armies that came from elsewhere. What is on the other side of the water? All of these things I want an answer to, and I'm more invested in the story because of that. Where this might get a little confusing is while this history that you're recording is not our world's history, it is the history of your world. That doesn't mean it doesn't take place on Earth. So Tolkien has said that Middle Earth isn't another planet, it is our Earth. However, it is our Earth at a different stage of imagination. Which I think is a really interesting way of putting it. Because what Tolkien believes is that while all artists are creators, they're not the creator. The creator is God. He is who made the world, and it is his imagination that shaped the world where we live. And so while human beings are inherently creators, they are not the creator. They are sub-creators who create in a sub-world or a secondary world. You're not changing how our world works. You're creating another one, essentially a parallel world, where you are redefining it and changing things based off of your taste. You're reorganizing our world into your world in a way that is aesthetically pleasing for you. And so the way that Tolkien described it is, I think because being made by a creator, one of our natural factors is wishing to create. But since we aren't creators, we have to sub-create. Let's say we have to rearrange the primary material in some particular form which pleases. It isn't necessarily a moral pleasing, it's partly an aesthetic pleasing. And so the rules of your world, right, because this might feel contradictory to the fact that you are just recording a history, but you're also sub-creating this world, so they feel like they conflict with each other. But the way in which I kind of think these things are different is like you are creating the world and then discovering the history that happens on that world. Like the world is shaped based off of your aesthetic choices. Like the reason that Tolkien told a story that took place in what feels like the Middle Ages, with like knights and castles and dragons and magic and wizards, is because he'd been studying mythology. Like these were the things he liked. Like he told a story he wanted to hear, but he didn't know what that story was going to be. Like he created the world where the story could take place and uncovered the story that was there. So the reason that The Lord of the Rings, again, has all these things, because that's what Tolkien liked. That's what Tolkien wanted. But he didn't know how all of these things were going to come together to create the story. And so you're sub-creating a world that is not our own. That is, you're taking the pieces of our world, what exists in our world, and you're reorganizing them into a sub-world based off of your own aesthetic preferences. And so what he says, I think that what is key to a secondary world, so what really happens is that the story maker proves a successful sub-creator. He makes a secondary world which your mind can enter. Inside it, what he relates is true. It accords with the laws of that world. You therefore believe it, while you were, as it were, inside. The moment disbelief arises, the spell is broken. The magic, or rather art, has failed. You are then out in the primary world again, looking at the little abortive secondary world from the outside. There is a lot in that quote that we could pull apart and talk about. There's a couple of like core things I really want to hit on. But to Tolkien, what proves a successful sub-creator is your ability to step into this world. There's a lot in this quote that we could pull apart and talk about, and a lot that I really like. There's two main things I definitely want to talk about, but what Tolkien is saying here is that to him, a successful sub-creator is somebody who's able to create a world that you can step into and be in that world and believe that it is true. And the two lines that I want to talk about further is, one, it accords with the laws of the world, which is what allows you to enter that world and for it to feel true, which we've kind of talked about already. But also the moment disbelief arises, the spell is broken. Those are the two things I want to talk about. We'll start with the first one. Accords with the laws of the world. This creates, by having laws to your world, or rules, or whatever you want to call them, it creates a level of consistency. It creates the logic that your audience is able to follow, that you are following when you're writing it. So the audience believes in the world. And so the rules of the world, you could look at it this way, because the story is revealing itself to you. The rules of the world are your aesthetic preferences that are guiding the creation of that world. Like the rules of the subworld run downstream from the rules of the real world. You're just remixing what already exists into your subworld. Another example is like, another way to explain this is with George Miller, so the director of Mad Max. And obviously with a film, which is differently from Lord of the Rings and Middle Earth, where Tolkien is literally doing everything himself. He's describing everything. He knows every single thing. On a movie like Mad Max, George Miller isn't making all of the cars himself. He's not designing every single prop. And so he created the rules for the wasteland in Mad Max that everyone was going to follow so that everything was consistent in the world. He said the two rules when it came to designing things inside of Mad Max was, one, everything had to come from found objects repurposed. That is, found objects exist in our world, but the way in which they're used is repurposed for the wasteland. And so that's when I say like the rules of your subworld run downstream from the rules of our real world. Like you have to base your subworld. It is a subworld of our world. So therefore what exists in ours is what is going to guide how you mold and shape yours. And so for George, it was everything must be made from found objects repurposed, because this is a post-apocalyptic story and we're not going to be creating new things. We have to take what is already out there, what already exists in our world, and use it to design the cars in the subworld. The second thing is that just because it's the wasteland does not mean that beauty cannot exist. And so while they're taking these things, these found objects, and they're using them to create beautiful things. And this is what guided every single person who worked on a Mad Max Fury Road and Furiosa. They were following these rules when creating the props and the vehicles and designing this world. It had these rules that were guided by the aesthetic preferences of George Miller that were set in our own world, but just repurposed for the subworld. Tolkien on this said, of course, a poor man who is building a story has to build out of some of the things he himself knows. He doesn't rush around doing Roman history and go and see what happened. But that means if he's been brought up, as I was, on ordinary history and on reading, that would be the material out of which he constructs. You build your world based off of what you know. You are just remixing what you know into the story. And the other quote, or the other part of that quote that I really want to talk about, was the moment disbelief arises, the spell is broken. This is why the laws of your world and the consistency of your world is so important. Because the second the audience starts thinking about your world, like if something doesn't make sense and they're trying to figure it out, if they're trying to understand your world, they're not paying attention to your story. And the second your world doesn't make sense, that is when the illusion is broken. That the moment disbelief in your world arises, the spell is broken. People are no longer invested in the story. They're no longer in the world. They're outside the world trying to understand how the world works and how this was constructed because it doesn't make sense to them. That is why the laws are so important. They are what creates the consistency, which creates the believability. And if we talk about Mad Max again, I got the chance to speak to John Seal, who was the cinematographer of Mad Max Fury Road. And he told me that when he sat down with George Miller to talk about the movie, about making the movie for the first time, what George told John was he wanted, one, this is with the speed of the movie, but also in which how engrossing it is into the world, is he wanted people to sit down in the theater. The movie starts, they are drawn up into the screen, and they do not even touch their popcorn until the movie ends because they are so invested in the world. And John told me the second that somebody would stop to question the world of Mad Max, they would go shoo out of the screen and back into their seats and they'd be eating their popcorn. And that was not what they wanted. They wanted people to be so invested that they didn't even touch their popcorn. They didn't want to break the spell. They wanted to create the world that was so consistent and so engrossing that people would be sucked into it until the story ended. And we want to talk about the ways in which Tolkien tried to keep the the spell, to keep his audience engrossed in The Lord of the Rings. Here's his biographer describing kind of the lengths at which he went to keep things consistent. So this is quoting Humphrey Carpenter. He felt he must ensure that every single detail fitted satisfactorily into the total pattern. Geography, chronology, and nomenclature all had to be entirely consistent. He had been given some assistance with the geography, for his son Christopher helped him by drawing an elaborate map of the terrain covered by the story. Tolkien himself had been making rough sketch maps since beginning work on the book. He once said, if you're going to have a complicated story, you must work to a map. Otherwise, you'll never make a map of it afterwards. But the map in itself was not enough, and he had endless calculations of time and distance, drawing up elaborate charts concerning events in the story, showing dates, the days of the week, the hours, and sometimes even the direction of the wind and the phase of the moon. This was partly his habitual insistence on perfection, partly sheer reveling in the fun of sub-creation, but most of all a concern to provide a totally convincing picture. Long afterwards, he said, I wanted people simply to get inside the story and take it in a sense as actual history. If you want people to treat your story as true, if you want them to view it as an actual history, it has to be as consistent as our actual history. If people can poke holes in your history, that completely ruins not only your world, but it ruins your story. It needs to be consistently sound. You don't want people to be able to poke obvious holes in it, because as soon as they do that, again, it breaks the spell. They are no longer believe in it, and they are no longer in your world. They're on the outside looking in, poking holes in it. You need to be incredibly thought out on every single little detail. Every single thing in your story must be able to justify its existence. And here's Tolkien talking about the level of work he did just on not the story, but on where the moon rises in his story. The moons, I think, finally the moons and the suns have worked out according to what they were in this part of the world in 1942, actually. I'm not a good enough mathematician or astronomer to work out where they might have been 7,000 or 8,000 years ago. But as long as they correspond to some real configuration, I thought it was good enough. Moons are much more tricky to deal with than suns, but on the whole, I don't think the moon is full or rises in the wrong place. This shows the level of detail required to make a world feel real. And Tolkien spent a lot of time rewriting The Lord of the Rings because he realized his moons and suns were inconsistent. Sometimes they would be in the wrong place, sometimes they would be the wrong size, and he wanted nothing to be able to break your belief in the story. And so that is why he spent a lot of time rewriting and mapping the moon cycle in England in 1942 to the moon cycle in Lord of the Rings, that at least there's a level of consistency and reality to it there. And that is why when Humphrey Carpenter is talking about this meeting he had with Tolkien, where he's stressing about an inconsistency that a reader pointed out to him, he wasn't just stressing because, oh no, I got it wrong. He was stressing because he realized that if one person saw this, then more people could see it. And the more people that saw it, it would break their illusion. It would break them out of his secondary world and bring them back to this one. And that was not his objective. He wanted to keep you in the secondary world from the beginning of the story all the way to the end. And any little inconsistency took you out of that. And he took that seriously. If you want people to treat your secondary world as a real history, then you have to treat the history as seriously as you would our history. But one thing about this idea of the secondary world is I mentioned how Tolkien views all artists as sub-creators, meaning they all create in a secondary world. And I think the framing of all art as not being in our real world is actually really important, because I think even if a story takes place today, or even if it's based on a true story, it is not real. Like anything based on a true story is going to have certain omissions or certain restructuring of information in order to make the story more aesthetically pleasing based off of the person who is telling that story. Even if you lived through it and you are telling the story to someone else, you are changing some details in order to make it a better story. Our real world, all stories all art exists in a secondary world. Watch any biopic. It is based on a true story, and yet it is not the actual thing that happened. I just watched the Tolkien biopic. It was okay. But there was information that they moved around. There was details that they changed. And the reason for that is because they wanted to make the story more aesthetically pleasing for the viewer. And when I say aesthetically pleasing, you're making changes based off of the story and the emotion you are trying to convey. And so any art does not take place in the real world. It all takes place in a secondary world because there is some changing or restructuring of the rules of the world or the information in a way that makes your story better. And that's a good thing. I want that to be like a liberating thing to you as an artist. Because if you're telling a story, especially if you're trying to tell a true story or a story that takes place today, I think you obviously want the rules to be consistent, but you want to be consistent with your world. And I think where artists can sometimes run into friction is like trying to make their subworld accord to the rules of the actual world, and those two things conflict, and it can drive you crazy as an artist. And so if you treat your story as not being in the actual world, but in a subworld, even if it takes place in a world that is very, very close to ours, there are going to be some things you can change in order to make the story more aesthetically pleasing. Because I mentioned this in the past, but like I work as a story director for a storytelling event. And one of the things I tell all of our storytellers is like, do not let the truth get in the way of a good story. Because the reason we're telling a story is to communicate an emotion with intentionality. Like we want the audience to feel a certain kind of emotion or see a way in which we see the world. And so all we need to focus on the story around is the things that are going to make people feel that emotion. It has to be consistent. Like we can't tell straight up lies. There has to be a level of consistency there. Like we're not doing things for the sake of convenience. But when I'm working with these storytellers, I might tell them like reorder some things because it'll make the story flow a little bit better. It'll take the audience on a bit more of a journey. And we just massage a few details just to make it so that the audience feels exactly what we want them to feel. And so I like this framing though, and I'm going to bring this lesson when I'm working with these storytellers. It's like this story you're telling does not take place in the real world. It takes place in a sub-world where we can reorder some things and change some things based off of like our aesthetic preferences. And you can do that as well as an artist. And to me at least, learning that and like hearing Tolkien talk about this in the secondary world was like a liberating thing for me as an artist. And what makes subworlds so interesting to me is that while they are fake worlds that help you see the truth about our actual world. There's this quote of Tolkien's where he says that he regards news on the whole as trivial and fit to be ignored, and that the only truth is to be found in literature. I don't expand literature to all art in general, but that these subworlds that you're creating are how people find truth about our actual world. But the thing is that the truth that people are going to be picking up from your subworld is not the reason that subworld exists. Tolkien also believed that while literature was where truth is really only to be found, he also believed that the primary function of literature is not to communicate truth, but to be enjoyed. There's this letter he wrote to, I think it was a fan or a relative after The Lord of the Rings was published. He says, I hope that you have enjoyed The Lord of the Rings. Enjoyed is the key word, for it was written to amuse in the highest sense, to be readable. I think that fairy story has its own mode of reflecting truth, different from allegory or sustained satire or realism, and in some ways more powerful. But first of all, it must succeed just as a tale, excite, please, and even on occasion move, and within its own imagined world be accorded literary belief. To succeed in that way was my primary object. But of course, if one sets out to address adults, mentally adult people anyway, they will not be pleased, excited, or moved unless the whole or the incident seem to be about something worth considering. More than mere danger and escape, there must be some relevance to the human situation. And then in brackets, he wrote, of all periods. That's another quote that I absolutely love of his. And there's a few takeaways from it that I have. And so one, you need fiction. You need to learn from fiction, but you can't do that without entertainment, right? Like we talked about with your world, you're not giving a lecture, you're not making a documentary, you are telling a story. And so that needs to be your primary objective, is to tell a good story. But that story also needs to have some things that are relevant to people. There has to be something more under the surface that people can dig into to connect with. Something that is of relevance to the human situation or to the human condition. Right? James Cameron, if we bring it back to him again, talked about how all of his stories need to connect in some way to universal human experiences. Something that all people all over the world from all time periods can relate to. And you know what that thing is? It's one word. Emotion. This is me adding my own perspective on it now, but human beings all over the world can connect to the emotion. People have felt love, they have felt pain, they have felt sadness, they have felt joy, no matter when and where they lived. And so that is what people are going to connect with your story. No one has been to Middle Earth. It doesn't exist. Even if you are telling a true story, I watched the Tolkien documentary the other day. No one watching that movie knows what it's like to be JRR Tolkien. But everyone who's watching that movie knows what it's like to have a group of friends that you love dearly. A lot of people knows what it means, what it feels like to lose somebody that you love dearly. And so while I can't relate to being JRR Tolkien, what I can relate to is that emotion. That emotion is what allows me to connect with the story and see his worldview in a way that just the biography couldn't do. The universal of the human experience, the human situation, is the emotions that people experience. That is what is going to allow people to connect to your story, which will then allow them to see your worldview in a way that they could not achieve on their own. But they're only able to do that if you tell them a story that is good enough. In a world that is consistent, they need to be in that world, in that story, believing in it fully in order for them to be moved in that way so that they are able to then see the world from your worldview, to get that lesson and to learn that truth. You have to entertain the audience first. However, you're not just there to entertain the audience. You need to have something more. To quote James Cameron, who talks about something very, very similar, and this is a quote I come back to all the time because I love it so much. And this is directly applicable to what Tolkien is saying here. He said the greatest goal of a filmmaker is to entertain, which is exactly what Tolkien is saying about literature. He literally said his primary objective was for it to be enjoyed. Entertainment makes things enjoyable. The greatest goal of a filmmaker is to entertain. If you have something to say, let it be said in such a way that you're not chasing the audience out of the theater. You have to entertain first. But many filmmakers have forgotten that there must be something more than entertainment. If you're just going to entertain, why are you doing it? The audience will walk out, and when they come off the emotional roller coaster, they have nothing left. There's more to filmmaking than just selling popcorn. People enjoy entertainment, but they walk out of the theater. They walk into the theater for the entertainment. It's what they walk out of that's important. And there's this quote that Tolkien was asked later on in his life about what he wanted to be remembered for. And I think this is really important to the point that we're talking about right now. And the interviewer asked him, would you rather be remembered as a man who has said something or as a man who has made something? And Tolkien said, I don't think you can distinguish it. Unless it says something, it won't be remembered. Unless it says something, it won't be remembered. And the reason for this is because if it says something, it has the ability to change the life of the person who watched it. No one is changed by a movie or a book or a video game that is just cool. There has to be style. Right? We've talked about the creation of your subworld is based on aesthetic preferences. There has to be that, but there has to be substance beneath that. It can't be only substance because then it becomes a lecture and nobody wants to be told what to think. They want to learn for themselves, and you are going to let them discover it for themselves through the entertainment. You're distracting them with the story so they don't even realize what they are learning until after they've walked out of the theater or after they've closed the book. Now, the catch is you cannot set out to tell a story to intentionally communicate a message. Your story should never start with the message or the lesson you want to convey. Your story should start with the story itself. And the lesson will emerge out of that story, not a story emerging out of a lesson. One thing that Tolkien strongly disliked was allegory. An allegory is a story or a piece of art that can be interpreted to have a hidden meaning or representative of something else. Like, for example, with Lord of the Rings as the example, a lot of people think that it is an allegory for the Second World War, and like the ring represents the atomic bomb, or a lot of people think as well it's a Christian allegory, and we're going to talk about the Christian representation in Lord of the Rings in a moment. But Tolkien was staunchly against the idea of allegory. He was staunchly against the idea that he wrote the Lord of the Rings as a way to communicate an intentional lesson or a theme in his stories. He set out to write a story and things emerged out of it. And if you read the Tolkien letters or the letters of JRR Tolkien, there are constant references to him talking about how much he disliked allegory, how much The Lord of the Rings has no allegory. Even if you read the foreword of The Lord of the Rings, he discusses how he just set out to write a story that there was no intentional allegory placed into this story. And I was reading this and I was conflicted, because when I studied George Miller, one of the things that George Miller talked about is how all stories are allegorical. He said the great thing about these sorts of stories, all of those films, including the Mad Max movies, is that they're allegorical. In other words, they can be interpreted according to the audience. It's in the eye of the beholder. And I was like, well, that's true. And one of the stories I often cite when talking about how all stories are allegorical in the sense of George Miller is like, he wrote this movie called Babe, which was about a pig that becomes a sheepdog. And he was visiting someone in South Africa, and someone came up to him and they were like, thank you so much for making a movie about the apartheid. And George Miller was like, what are you talking about? And they were like, Babe. Like, Babe is clearly about the apartheid. They listed all of these reasons as to why Babe is like an allegory for the apartheid. And George was like, I didn't put that there, but just because I didn't intend for it to be there doesn't mean it isn't there either. And so George is talking about all stories are allegorical. How any person can find things in a movie. Again, it can be interpreted according to the audience. It's in the eye of the beholder. And so I was thinking about this, like, how do these two things relate? Where George Miller is saying every single story is allegory, while J.R.R. Tolkien is saying that he hates allegory and there's no allegory in Lord of the Rings, despite the fact that you can find things in it. And then I had this realization, and I wrote this down before I found this next quote, which was, I think Tolkien hated intentional allegory. The idea of forcing a message on your readers and writing a story because of it. And then I found this quote. I dislike allegory, the conscious and intentional allegory. Yet, any attempt to explain the purport of myth or fairy tale must use allegorical language. And of course, the more life a story has, the more readily will it be susceptible of allegorical interpretations. And so that's the distinction, is George Miller says any human being can find things in a story, whereas Tolkien they're saying the same thing of you can find anything in a story, but Tolkien is saying that you should not intentionally put things in the story for the purpose of creating intentional allegory. And so I think allegory is the wrong word in this situation, especially when we consider what George Miller is saying. And I think applicability is the better word. It's not placed there intentionally, but that doesn't mean you can't apply a story to your own life. And if you find it, it's there, but that does not mean that the author or the artist intentionally puts it there. Tolkien himself even admits that there are lessons in his stories, but that does not mean that they were put there intentionally. This is a letter he wrote to Stanley Unwin, who is the publisher of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and his son Rayner, who was also a publisher of The Lord of the Rings at this time. Actually, a fun story is when Rayner was a child, his dad gave him a copy of The Hobbit to read to get his thoughts as a child on this children's book. And Rayner liked it so much and ultimately ended up publishing The Hobbit. And then The Hobbit did well enough that they started asking for a sequel, which became The Lord of the Rings. But it took so long to write, like 14 years, that by the time Rayner had grown up, he was now working for his dad and helping to publish the sequel to The Hobbit. And so Rayner had written a letter to his dad about The Lord of the Rings, and then Stanley forwarded that letter with his own commentary to Tolkien. And this is Tolkien's response. Do not let Rayner suspect allegory. There is a moral, I suppose, in any tale worth telling, but that is not the same thing. Even the struggle between darkness and light, as he calls it, not me, is for me just a particular phase of history. One example of its pattern, perhaps, but not the pattern. And the actors are individuals. They each, of course, contain universals, or they would not live at all, but they never represent them as such. Of course, allegory and story converge, meeting somewhere in truth. So the only perfect, consistent allegory is a real life, and the only fully intelligible story is an allegory. And one finds even in imperfect human literature that the better and more consistent an allegory is, the more easily can it be read just as a story. And the better and more closely woven a story is, the more easily can those so minded find allegory in it. But the two start from opposite ends. Again, this gets a little bit confusing because it kind of feels like he's contradicting himself and saying there is no allegory, but there is allegory. But what he's saying is, from a sub-creator's point of view, you cannot start with both of those things in mind. You either start with story or you start with allegory. They start out from opposite ends, and they will meet somewhere along the way, but you cannot set out to do both at the same time. And for Tolkien, the notion that he would start out with allegory was borderline offensive to him because he was starting on the opposite side. He was starting out with story. For him, it was you start the story and you find the lesson along the way. You do not start with the lesson and find the story along the way. And really, when I was thinking about this, is like I view the creative process as like the act of process of using craft to process your thoughts, your feelings, your experiences. And so when you're making something, your work should teach you something about yourself that then the audience can learn from. You're not trying to teach the audience what you want to teach them. You're trying to teach yourself something about yourself that the audience will then relate to and learn from. You are not teaching the audience a specific lesson. Now, we need to talk about, there's a point I want to make here, but in order to do so, we have to talk about whether or not The Lord of the Rings is a Christian or Catholic book. Because Tolkien, and there's a couple of contradictions here as to whether or not it is or it isn't. Tolkien did not, his strong intentional allegory, like his strong aversion to intentional allegory makes me feel like The Lord of the Rings is not an explicit Christian or Catholic book. And this is a debate that a lot of people have online. You can see people talking about how The Lord of the Rings is a religious book or like a Catholic or a Christian book, and people arguing that it's not. And the answer is yes and no in both. Tolkien did not set out to write The Lord of the Rings as an explicit Christian book. His friend, Reverend Robert Murray, even said this in the Tolkien documentary. I wouldn't mean for a moment that it was his intention to write a book that would teach Catholic ideals. That wouldn't necessarily have been crude allegory, but it wouldn't have been the kind of thing that he would have done. The values are there all the time because he was that kind of person, but I don't think the primary intention at any time was to exhibit noble ideas to the world and try to persuade the world to live by them. I think he just held these ideals. The artist will always be present in the art, whether they do so intentionally or not. Who you are as a person is going to shape your artwork. And that is okay. That's what you want. You know, sometimes people in the world today, it feels like sometimes people try to remove these things that make them unique in order to make their work as broadly applicable to as many people as possible. But if you want people to pay attention to you, you're not going to achieve that by removing everything worth paying attention to. You should let yourself be reflected in your work, and that is going to happen, and you should double down on those things. Write your story in the best way you can, and the things you care about are naturally going to bubble up to the surface. Tolkien himself even said as much. He said, "As for a message, I have none really. If by that is meant the conscious purpose in the writing of The Lord of the Rings, of preaching or of delivering myself of a vision of truth specifically revealed to me. I was primarily writing an exciting story in an atmosphere and background such as I find personally attractive. But in such a process, inevitably, one's own tastes, ideas, and beliefs get taken up." So, all of that being said, is The Lord of the Rings a religious book? Yes and no. Because Tolkien held these Catholic ideals that are in The Lord of the Rings. Those are the things that he believed. Those are the things that he cared about. They are, of course, going to be representative in The Lord of the Rings. But does that also mean that, but also no, because he intentionally removed references to religion in the book. And I have a quote here, which is going to feel contradictory, but he said that The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work. So yes, it is a work, of course. Unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision. That is why I have not put in or have cut out practically all references to anything like religion, to cults or practices in the imaginary world, for the religious element is absorbed into the story and the symbolism. And so I think the part of the reason that people argue about whether or not The Lord of the Rings is a religious book or not, or religious work, is because Tolkien is both intentionally removing all of these things from any reference to religion. Like, he has acknowledged that God exists in The Lord of the Rings, but he is never once mentioned, because to him, I'm trying to figure out how to word this properly, because I think the conclusion I'm coming to is, yes, it is. I mean, Tolkien himself here is acknowledging the fact that it is a religious work. But he's doing so in a way that removes religion from... See, but here's where it gets contradictory. He's removing religion from the book in order to have the ideals of the religion be communicated to people. So I think the challenge that people run into when trying to interpret whether or not The Lord of the Rings is a religious work is, if you are a religious person, you are going to identify with those ideals as religious ideals. But if you are not a religious person, you'll be able to identify with those ideals, just not in a way that you view them as a religious ideal. They are just a good way of being a good human being. But to Tolkien, in order to be a good human being, it was by following these religious ideals. And so people can pick up on these ideals in Tolkien's work, but he disguised them so well and in such a way that they're not directly tied to religion. And that was a very intentional thing for him. He even talked about part of the reason he wrote The Lord of the Rings was because he wanted to create a English mythology, one that he wished had existed, because he didn't feel like there was enough English mythology out there. And so he wanted to create his own. And one of the ones people would point to, well, what about this one? They would often point to King Arthur. And for him, he had multiple issues with King Arthur. He did enjoy it, but he also had many issues with it. Part of the fact is it was a British mythology, not a specific English mythology. But one thing he talked about why he didn't necessarily like the King Arthur or the Arthurian mythology was, he said, for another and more important thing, it is involved in and explicitly contains the Christian religion. For reasons which I will not elaborate, that seems to me fatal. Myth and fairy story must, as all art, reflect and contain in solution elements of moral and religious truth or error, but not explicit, not in the known form of the primary real world. And so for Tolkien, again, it is a religious work for him, but he is removing religion from the lessons to communicate the ideals of his religion so that anybody can pick up on them. And the people who are religious will identify those as religious ideals, but people who are not will get the ideals that Tolkien was trying to share, but not necessarily through the lens of religion. And so this is why I think you could go around and around and around on whether or not it is a religious work, because there is no definitive answer to this question. It is and it isn't at the same time. There's one other thing I really want to talk about, though, with that quote where he's talking about The Lord of the Rings being a fundamentally religious or Catholic work. Because he said when he set out to write The Lord of the Rings initially, his goal, of course, he said, I was primarily writing an exciting story in an atmosphere and background such as I find personally attractive. That is why he set out to write The Lord of the Rings. And then he talked about how, of course, the book became a fundamentally religious or Catholic work. But he said unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision. Because when you write a story for the sake of the story itself, the artist is always going to be present in that work. So when you write that first draft, when you write the story for the first time, the things you care about, the ideals you hold, are naturally going to emerge in your story. They're going to bubble up to the surface subconsciously. And you're not even going to realize that they're there until you read the story back and you go to revise it and you realize what your subconscious was trying to communicate through the story. And once you see that, you can then start to make revisions to the story to augment that ideal or augment that theme in a way that is consistent with the story. The problem with starting with the lesson first is you are going to make decisions to the story that do not enhance the story, that are not consistent with the story for the intention of getting your message out there. But when the theme or the message or the moral is already in the story naturally, it is going to continue to be naturally as you make revisions to the story. And so Tolkien realized that all of these ideals he held were emerging in The Lord of the Rings. So when he revised it, he made revisions based off of it, essentially highlighting or accentuating those ideals in a way that was consistent with the story. But in order to do so, he felt it very important to remove all references of religion, of cults, of practices, in order for people to be able to pick up on those ideals, in order to make those ideals transmissible to anyone. But the punchline here is that when you write your first draft, you write the story for the sake of the story. You do not even think about the theme or the message or the moral until you start to revise the story. And speaking of revision, Tolkien revised The Lord of the Rings again and again and again. And I was going to say that the reason for that is because he's something of a perfectionist. But if I'm being honest with you, he just was a perfectionist. When describing him, his biographer said that Tolkien had a passion for perfection in written work of any kind, whether it be philology or stories. This grew from his emotional commitment to his work, which did not permit him to treat it in any manner other than the deeply serious. Nothing was allowed to reach the printer until it had been revised, reconsidered, and polished. And I just want to also give a quick shout out to Humphrey Carpenter, Tolkien's biographer, because that is a beautifully written paragraph and he is a great writer. It was an enjoyable read for sure. But there's a few things in this specific paragraph that I want to pull out and discuss. The first one being Tolkien's passion for perfection. Because I feel like, and I've talked about this on the show in the past, because it's something I'm passionate about, that perfection has become demonized. That we live in a culture that puts out work so consistently, so quickly, that we don't allow ourselves to have time to focus on perfection. And as a result, we have demonized it. Because if our goal is speed, perfection has the ability to hinder your speed and to hinder your output. And so there's like the perfect isn't perfect, good enough is perfect. But I push back on that notion. And I think obviously you could make a case where art and media are different, and what is being put up on the internet is more often media than art, and perfection might not have as much of a place in media as it does art. But I think that this notion of perfect isn't perfect, good enough is perfect, is starting to permeate into art. And I think that that's a dangerous notion, because perfection, while impossible to achieve, you'll never get, if perfection is at 100%, you'll never get to 100%. It is impossible to do so. That does not mean it is a bad idea to try, because while perfection is impossible to achieve, in its pursuit, masterpieces occur. And so if you're striving for perfection and you fail, so if you don't get to 100, you might fail at 90%, which would be considered a masterpiece to almost everyone. But if your goal is, if you accept the fact that perfection is impossible and therefore there is no reason to try and achieve it, you might set your goal as a 75 and maybe you'll hit it, but maybe you'll fail 75 and be like a 65 versus the person who was striving for perfection, didn't hit 100, but they hit 90 and they're higher than the person who hit their goal at 75. And so I am a strong believer in the importance of being a perfectionist, of treating every single detail in your story with a level of care and respect. That somebody who's worried, who over-indexes on the importance of speed, will pass over because most people won't notice those details, which is true, but we've spent so much time talking about Tolkien, talking about how he built his worlds, how every little detail was explainable, and he spent time working on all of these things. And so perfection is impossible, but in its pursuit, masteries occur. Now, I will caveat this by saying I do believe that striving for perfection can bloat your process and can become a hindrance of you putting out work, which is why my caveat is perfection is important with constraints. You need to know how much time you have and make a masterpiece, or to try and get as perfect as possible in that time frame. Perfection with no deadline can become a negative. But Tolkien, and I mean, Tolkien, we even see this a little bit, right? Like The Lord of the Rings, it took him over a decade to write, it took over 15 years to publish the book, but that was just who he was. He had this passion for perfection. And a reason for that is like, this next thing we'll talk about is this emotional commitment to his work, which did not permit him to treat it in any manner other than the deeply serious. Take your work seriously. Like we talked about this in the last deep dive on Jaco Pastorius, but like if you want people to take you seriously, if you want them to take your work seriously, you need to take it seriously. I think part of the reason I like this idea of taking the work deeply seriously is because we live in a world where people are so focused on the outcomes that the work is just a means to an end, and they don't take the work that seriously. They just look at the work as something that is going to help them achieve X, and the work is not the reason for doing the thing. Like people want to be YouTubers, people want to be TikTokers for the life they think it affords them, not for the act of making TikToks and making YouTube videos. And Tolkien, while he wanted people to see his work, and we are going to talk about that, his priority was the work itself. And he took that work incredibly seriously, which is why he was a perfectionist, which is why nothing went to the printer until it had been revised, reconsidered, and polished. And I like this idea of breaking this revised, reconsidered, and polished into three separate categories. Because when I often think of a revision, I think of all of these three things happening in tandem. You're revising it, you're making it better, which is therefore you're reconsidering what you wrote, and you're polishing it. But I think that these three things as independent steps in the process is a really interesting idea, and one I hadn't actually thought about until I was literally sitting down today to go through my notes, and I was just doing a quick read through before I hit record, and I kind of got stuck on those three words, and I had to spend more time to kind of break them apart into what they each look like. But it's like revising is making sure you are communicating your idea in the best way possible, whether that is an essay, whether that is a story, is what you are trying to convey being done in the best way possible. That's step one. Step two is, are you actually saying the right thing here? Reconsidering. Is this actually what you're trying to say? And three is, I guess, revision is making it clear. Reconsidering is making sure it's the right thing to be saying. And polishing it is making it better. I've made it clear, but now how do I make this point even better? And so those are three things. Like when Tolkien, when it came to his revision process, when it came to his perfectionism, part of the issue was that he would always, especially when it came to reconsidering, is when Tolkien would sit down with his friends, and Tolkien had a group of friends at Oxford. They called themselves the Inklings, and it was they would have these informal meetings at a popular bar called the Eagle and Child, or the Bird and Baby, as people referred to it. And they would just basically hang out, drink beer, smoke their pipes, and talk about their works and talk about, literature. And they would just have these like deep, meaningful conversations. And Tolkien would often read passages of The Lord of the Rings to these people. And C.S. Lewis said that his standard of self-criticism was high, and the mere suggestion of publication usually set him upon a revision, in the course of which so many new ideas occurred to him that where his friends had hoped for the final text of an old work, they actually got the first draft of a new one. And so for Tolkien, the challenge that he ran into was upon revising his work, he would actually have so many new ideas, or he would reconsider what he'd written, which would then lead to new ideas, that he was just always in this loop of he would take, like, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, like the whole time he's writing Lord of the Rings, which is part of the reason that it took so long. But I think what's interesting about Tolkien and his perfection is I was thinking, like, what drives perfection in someone? And I think there's like 2 primary things that drive someone to be a perfectionist. And I think it's love and insecurity. And Tolkien had both of those 2 things. Like, he took his work deeply seriously. He loved his work. He loved what he did, and therefore he wanted it to be as great as it possibly could be. But there's also a level of insecurity driving him, especially with the desire to put his work into the world. He knows that he's going to get feedback in some way. And for him, he talked about how he wrote this book in his lifeblood. And when he publishes the book, he's exposing his heart to be shot at, which is a scary thing to do. And that insecurity comes into the process for Tolkien. And that is why he is revising and he's always making changes, because he loves what he does. He wants to be as great as he can be, but he's also insecure about what people will think about it. But even though sometimes, again, Tolkien would get feedback from his friends, he'd get feedback from the Inklings, and it would send him into this spiral of revision that then ultimately led into new work, he didn't always listen to the feedback that he got. C.S. Lewis again said that Tolkien has only two reactions to criticism. Either he begins the whole work over again from the beginning, or else he takes no notice at all. And I actually like that as a heuristic of when you're getting feedback from someone, especially if you're getting feedback from multiple people, it can become difficult to parse through it. And you're trying to factor in all of the feedback and do all of these things with it. And you can essentially get to a point where if you intake too much feedback from too many sources, you're diluting what you've made. It's like if you had a glass of orange juice and you had people try it, and everyone gave feedback on what that orange juice was supposed to taste like. And so you were making all of these changes. You were adding all of these other flavors to your orange juice to try to get them to a point where everybody would like it. You'd end up with a drink that was undrinkable. And so Tolkien, sometimes when the feedback was, if Tolkien, I guess the heuristic here is like, again, either you take the feedback seriously or you don't take the feedback at all. I think that middle ground, that gray area is where you can start to drown yourself in the feedback, and you can create, you lose yourself trying to appease too many people. And so this idea of Tolkien would either rewrite the entire thing, you would take it very seriously, or he wouldn't take any notice to your feedback at all, I actually think is a good way of approaching it. But I bet you, back to this idea of love and insecurity when it comes to Tolkien's perfection, I would bet that when Tolkien didn't change, when he didn't take the feedback, he wouldn't take it because he knew what he had was good. And he loved it so much that he knew it was good enough for, reached his standards. So even when a friend of his, like C.S. Lewis or one of the other Inklings would give him feedback, if he was confident in what he'd written, he wouldn't make a change. But I bet you when he would intake their feedback and rewrite the entire thing, I would bet you that he came into that Inklings meeting a little insecure about what he'd written already. Like he already himself wasn't sure about it, and all he needed was confirmation from some other party. And if they were essentially confirmed that insecurity, he would go right back to square one and rewrite the entire thing. I don't know that for sure. That is just my assumption. I want to make that abundantly clear, but that, I think, that makes sense to me, is that with perfection coming from love and insecurity, how Tolkien would respond to criticism would be based off of whether he knew what he'd written, if he loved it and he knew it was great, or if he was insecure a little bit because he himself wasn't exactly sure if what he'd written was as good as it possibly could be. And so this is a big reason as to why this perfection that Tolkien was striving for was a big reason as to why he published so slowly. And I was thinking about the fact of publishing slowly, and I don't necessarily know if that's a bad thing. And I was looking back over the episodes I've done of the show so far, and this slow publishing is somewhat of a consistent theme. Tolkien obviously publishes quite slowly. James Cameron publishes quite slowly, especially in this back half of his career. George Miller publishes slowly. The God of War games also publish slowly in a sense in the video game context. Like you look at a game like God of War, which was phenomenal when they put it out in 2018, was phenomenal again when they put it out in 2022, 2023. And each time God of War makes a release, it becomes one of the greatest games ever put out on the console it was put out on. Then you look at Call of Duty, which just released what is considered one of, if not the worst Call of Duty ever released. And they're on an annual release cadence. Like there is a benefit to publishing slowly where you can implement learnings about yourself and about your art that you don't get if you're just publishing so quickly. Like there's this notion of there's this parable of two people are told to make the perfect bowl, and one person they have the same amount of time to try and make the perfect bowl, and one person sets out with the first bowl that they try, and they try to make it perfect. And then the second person, instead of making one bowl, made 100 bowls. So by the time they got to their 100, they'd learned so much they were able to make this bowl perfectly, able to sculpt it perfectly. And I think that there's truth to that. I think there's truth to learning your craft through reps. Like, you get better in the beginning just through doing repetitions, but eventually I think you get so good that you need more time to get better. Like, the rate at which you learn and improve does not stay consistent throughout your entire trajectory as an artist. In the beginning, absolutely, go make 100 bowls because you do need the experience. But once you have the experience, speed no longer becomes a differentiator, right? Like, the way I think about progress, and I think that the challenging thing with progress is progress occurs when it feels like none is happening. Like, we associate progress with reaching a destination, but I looked up the definition for progress in the Oxford Dictionary, and the definition of progress was something along the lines like movement towards an improved situation, not reaching an improved situation. And so progress is the act of just doing the thing. But I think the progress paradox that I call it is that progress essentially compounds inversely. The better you get, the harder it is to reach the next level. And so to go from like level 0 to 1, it's going to take a certain level of effort. To go from 1 to 2 is going to take up with the same level of effort. But to go from level 2 to 3 is going to take as much effort as it took you to go from 0 to 2. And that continues. So then to go from 3 to 4, it's going to take you as much effort as it took you to go from 0 to 3. And then from 4 to 5, it's going to take you as much effort as it took you to go from 0 to 4. And this continues onwards and onwards and onwards. And so it becomes harder and harder and harder to get quote unquote better. In the beginning, yes, you can go quickly, you can learn quickly, but the amount of work it takes to get better becomes greater. And so it's going to take you longer. And speed is not the only way in which you can improve. Again, I think it is important in the beginning to just ship, to get your reps in, to do it over and over and over again, to develop the skill. But once you have the skill, you have to start what you need to do to improve becomes different. So God of War, for example, they put out the first game in 2005, the second game in 2007, the third game in 2010, the fourth game in 2013, the fifth game in 2018, and then the sixth game, there's some like other like side games in there, but this is just the main line, and then the sixth game in 2023. And so the amount of time between each God of War game is getting longer and longer and longer. And I think the reason for that is because they're getting better and better and better. The games are also becoming bigger and bigger, but Call of Duty is still an annual release cadence, and their quality of game is going down, while God of War's games is continuing to either go up or stay level because they were already at such a high level. And so there are benefits to publishing slowly, especially I think in a world that publishes so quickly. There's this Tim Ferriss quote I think about a lot, where he talks about how he doesn't worry about speed because if you try to play the speed game, you're either going to have to use the machines or lose to the machines, essentially. Like in the world in which we are going towards, people who produce content with AI are going to be able to do so at a much faster rate than someone who does not. And as an artist, you may not be someone who wants to produce content using AI, which is, I think, absolutely fine and something that I respect. But that means you're not going to be able to keep up at the rate of somebody who's using AI. And I think the countermeasure to art or content made with AI is art that does the exact opposite. You're not going to beat the machines by trying to be like them. You have to find the strengths that you have that the machine doesn't have and lean into those things. And so there are benefits to publishing slowly. And Tolkien, I have a couple of quotes here talking about why you want to publish slowly and the benefits of doing so. So Tolkien, this is him talking about the Lord of the Rings. It's a little bit heady, so I'll try to walk through it. And I'll use his biographer. I have a few of his biographer quotes put together that explain a little bit better. But the reason why you should take your time when it comes to publishing your work. One writes such a story not out of the leaves of trees still to be observed, nor by means of botany and soil science, but it grows like a seed in the dark out of the leaf mold of the mind. And so what he's kind of saying here is that the Lord of the Rings grew out of the mold of his mind, which is like the amalgamation of all of the things that he has learned, and of all that has been seen or thought or read that has long ago been forgotten, descending into the deeps. No doubt there is much selection, as with a gardener, what one throws on one's personal compost heap, and my mold is evidently made largely of linguistic matter. And here is Humphrey Carpenter, his biographer's commentary on this. Vegetable matter has to decompose for a long time before it is broken down sufficiently to be used to enrich the soil. And Tolkien is saying here that it was almost exclusively upon early experience, sufficiently broken down by time, that he nourished the seeds of his imagination. One learned little by raking through a compost heap to see what dead plants originally went into it. Far better to observe its effect on the new and growing plants that it is enriching. And in The Hobbit, the leaf mold of Tolkien's mind nurtured a rich growth with which only a few other books in children's literature can compare. And again, so a little heady, a lot of talk about gardening and stuff, but gardening was a passion, or a hobby, I should say, of Tolkien's. He also loved trees. But the takeaway here from these two quotes put together is the idea that your experiences take a long time to break down. And in a world where you're publishing so quickly, you don't have the time to properly reflect on your experiences and reflect them in your work. You know, we talked about this when we talked about Joni Mitchell, where she says she will have an experience, but she won't write about it right away. She said, I have to write a long time after something has happened, because when I'm in the middle of something, I'm totally emotional and blind. I can't get a perspective on it. And so what Tolkien is saying here is that like the longer it takes you to publish something, the more time you have from the inspiration to the moment of, we'll say, release, is you have more time to process things. And the more time you've had to process things, the more deeply you understand those things. Versus when you're trying to make art about something that happened yesterday, you haven't truly processed that yet. And it is going to be the surface level feelings that you have about these experiences that are going to make it into your work, not the deep processing, the deep work you have done to work through your experiences, or, and to Tolkien's point, all the things that you have read or seen or thought of. Like all of these things work together in order to, all these had to break down in order to produce something like The Lord of the Rings. And so all of the new experiences you're having are kind of being thrown on top of the compost heap, and they're not going to be the things that have broken down sufficiently to fertilize your next idea. They're still too fresh. They haven't turned into mold. They haven't broken down yet. And so you need that time for these influences for you to process them, for them to break down, so that mixing with all of your other experiences, for them to be used and to turn into something that you create. And one other thing, if you do publish slowly, is it forces you to appreciate the work while you're doing it. I think part of the issue with publishing so quickly is that when doing so, you don't actually have the time to stop and process what you're making. You are literally just making the thing as a means to getting the thing out there so you can start work on the next thing. That's literally what it becomes when you're publishing so quickly. Like I see this in myself when I'm putting out social media content. I'm literally just trying to make the social media content so I have the social media content to put out on a consistent basis, which is part of the reason why I dislike making content for social media so much. I do think I've found a format that's going to work for me to allow me to be consistent while still remaining about this work, but that's besides the point. But if you do publish slowly, you're not going to get as many opportunities to do the thing. And so therefore, each time you do it is going to be a blessing. Tolkien in his lifetime didn't publish that many books because of how long he spent working on each one. And more often than not too, like once you finish that work, if you spent a lot of time and put a lot of effort into it, you're not going to want to do it again. Like Tolkien, when talking about The Lord of the Rings, said he said it was a great labor. And as the author of the Acrine Wis says at the end of his work, I would rather, God be my witness, set out on foot for Rome than begin the work over again. And so by the time you do finish it, you're never coming back to it. And so I think when you publish slowly, not only does it give you this appreciation, but there's also this idea of I would never set out on foot, or I would rather set out on foot for Rome than begin the work over again. That's an interesting idea, because I think if you publish slowly, or if you publish something that takes more time, you really, over the course of your life, like in Tolkien's example, he didn't publish that many books in his lifetime. A lot of his books were published posthumously, with kind of his son Christopher doing a lot of the editorial work on those so that they were fit for publishing. But he didn't publish that much in his lifetime. Or if we look at some of the examples of the people who I mentioned who do publish slowly, James Cameron has only done like 10 films. George Miller, similar. God of War, there's only like 7 or 8 games that have existed in the last 20 plus years. There's not that many at-bats. And so if you do publish slowly, just appreciate the fact that you get to do so. And really, if we do think about this from a little bit, if you want to get a little bit more, think deeply about this, it's like the thing you're making now, you will never make ever again. I could record this podcast, this specific episode, in 3 years. And I will have learned different things. I will be a different person. I will be married at that point. Like, I will just be a different human being. And so therefore, the way in which I interpret these notes, the way in which I convey that information to you will be different from how I'm doing it right now. And so, yes, I could re-record this podcast later. It won't be what I make right now. And so where you're at in your life right now, you will never get the chance to come back and make the thing you are making right now with the people that you're making it with, being the person you are. This truly is the one and only time you get to make things. You never get to come back here. Even if you do publish frequently, you're never coming back to right now to make this thing. And so appreciate the opportunity that you have. Take the work deeply seriously. Perfection is not a bad thing. But if I'm being honest with you, perfection was only half the reason that JRR Tolkien took so long to publish The Lord of the Rings. Again, he started in, I believe, 1937. He finished in 1949. The book was published in 1954. So that's 17 years from the end of The Hobbit to the publication of its sequel, The Lord of the Rings. And obviously, yes, perfection was a part of the reason it took so long. But the other reason for it is that JRR Tolkien was not a full-time author. He was a regular dude with a job and responsibilities. He was a professor at Oxford. He was a father of 4. He was a husband. These things, life got in the way. Humphrey Carpenter said that it's a strange paradox that the fact that The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings are the work of an obscure Oxford professor whose specialization was the West Midland dialect of Middle English and who lived an ordinary suburban life, bringing up his children and tending his garden. I cannot stress this enough. J.R.R. Tolkien, yes, is a genius at world building, a genius linguistic, a genius storyteller, one of the greats. But he was also, for a large portion of his life, The Lord of the Rings was not published until he was in his 60s. He was quite literally just a regular guy. He had to deal with all of the things that you or I had to deal with. Even making money on the side to support himself and his family. J.R.R. Tolkien had side hustles. He had to freelance as an external examiner for other universities to make money. And Humphrey Carpenter said his time would have been better devoted to research or writing, but his concern for the family income made him spend many hours at this irritating task. He had a life, he had responsibilities, he had things to take care of. But I think that is one of the most validating things that I learned about in doing this. Like, he quite literally was just a regular guy with a passion for this work that he was doing that nobody even really knew he was doing, but it was important to him and he wanted to get it out there. But he had, like, when he published The Hobbit, it was successful enough for the publisher to ask for a sequel, but not successful enough that it changed Tolkien's life materially. And so he had a little bit of success, but it didn't change his life. But I think what's interesting is before he Before he published The Hobbit, he had been writing for The Hobbit. Hobbit was published in 1937. He started working on his mythology in the 1910s. And so, yes, the time from publication of The Hobbit to The Lord of the Rings is long, but the creation of Quenya to The Hobbit was even longer. And so he'd been working at this for decades at this point. And actually, the way that The Hobbit got published, I think, is an interesting story to discuss as well, because it was kind of a fluke. Tolkien had a former student that he showed the manuscript of The Hobbit to that he'd been working on. She read it, showed it to her friend who happened to work at Allen and Unwin, which was eventually became Tolkien's publisher. She read it. She liked it enough that she wrote to Tolkien and she was like, hey, can you finish this? Because the last few chapters weren't done. Can you finish this and send this back? Because finish this and send this back by like this specific time, because we'd like to publish this by this day. And so he did. And then they published the Hobbit. But the only reason that happened is because Tolkien's former student knew someone who worked at this publisher. So it's a bit of there was luck that occurred in that situation. Now, of course, my belief with luck is that all of the hard work actually, this is my belief, which I learned from James Cameron. All of the hard work you do makes you ready for your lucky break. So Tolkien had been working on his writing, on his mythology for almost 20 years. Then, although The Hobbit technically wasn't a part of his mythology when he initially wrote it, but that's a whole side thing. He'd been working at his craft for 20 years. He finally got an opportunity and he made the most of it. And so, yes, of course, there was luck involved, but the only reason that luck paid off was because of how good Tolkien was. But up to that point, like, he hadn't gotten any recognition, any appreciation. And so there's this really interesting letter that he wrote to Stanley Unwin, who was the publisher of Allen and Unwin. He wrote this letter to him after they expressed interest in publishing The Hobbit. I must confess that your letter has aroused in me a faint hope. I mean, I begin to wonder whether duty and desire may not, perhaps in future, go more closely together. I've spent nearly all the vacation times of 17 years examining and doing things of that sort, driven by immediate financial necessity, mainly medical and educational. Writing stories in prose or verse has been stolen, often guiltily, from time already mortgaged and has been broken and ineffective. I may perhaps now do what I much desire to do and not fail of financial duty. But I read this letter and I think of Tolkien as like this giant, this literary giant. This is the guy who created The Lord of the Rings. And when we think of Tolkien, we think of this guy who created The Lord of the Rings. But we never think of this guy. This guy who had this thing that he loved to do, but had never gotten the opportunity to do it professionally. All he wanted was to work on his mythology and to work on his craft, to tell his stories. But all of these life things came up and got in the way. And he was quite literally just a regular guy with a dream for so long. The Hobbit gave him a glimpse of what could be, but again, it didn't change his life materially in any significant way. He was not famous after publishing The Hobbit. It was, again, successful enough that they asked for a sequel, but that was it. His life didn't change. And so when he wrote The Lord of the Rings, the follow-up to The Hobbit, he had to do so contending with just all of the responsibilities of life. He was busy. He wrote at one point, like, there seems no time to do anything properly, and I feel tired all the time, or rather bored. I think if a djinn or a genie came and gave me a wish, what would you really like? I should reply, nothing, go away. And I just think that's hilarious. Like, but this also, like, it's hilarious, but it also shows, I guess, his commitment to his art. Like, there's nothing, he had what he wanted. He had his mythology and he wanted to work on it. I guess if he was to have made a wish, it would have been to have more time to work on his art. But like, the idea of like, he's so busy, wouldn't you take the time to think about that, is hilarious to me. He just had no time, but he made the time. He found a way to get the work done. and oftentimes when he would do the work, it would be at tough hours. It would be in the middle of the night. Like Tolkien often went to bed at like 2 a.m, even later, because he would wait until his family had gone to bed to begin writing. And so he just made the time. He said, I managed to get an hour or two's writing, and it brought Frodo nearly to the gates of Mordor. Afternoon lawn mowing, term begins next week, and proofs of Wales papers have come. Still, I'm going to continue, ring in every salvable moment. Life is busy. It absolutely is. But you have to make the time. If you want to do this, then you need to do it. Like, there is not going to be an ideal time to do your art. This show, although I go back and forth as to whether or not Artwell is art or if it is media, but that's another conversation. I love to do this show. I just mentioned I have a new job that I quite enjoy. It's at a tech startup, but because it's at a tech startup, that means it's a lot of hours. I don't leave the office until 7 o'clock some days, 8 o'clock on other days, because we're working hard. We're building a company. And so that requires a lot of work and a lot of time. But what that means is I have less time to do art well. And so I structure my weeks, not only talking about work, I'm also getting married. And so that requires a whole lot of planning, and massive shout out, of course, to my fiance who's handling a lot of that. But I have to find time to do art well. And a lot of things don't get done because I'm prioritizing this show. My goal is 1,000 minutes a week of art well, which is about 16.6, like 16 hours and 40 minutes a week. And I don't hit it every week, but that is my goal. There are times where I'm saying no to hanging out with friends or doing different things because I know I have to get the show done. If you want to see how badly you truly want this thing, whatever this thing is for you, look at your calendar and look at how much time you actually spend doing it. You have to make the time. There is never going to be an ideal time to do this. Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings while working full-time, while raising 4 kids, while battling constant illness. And even he wrote the final draft of The Lord of the Rings before sending it to his publishers by himself. And he didn't know how to type. He didn't know how to type. He couldn't afford to hire a typist because of all of these things I've mentioned. It wasn't making a lot of money. So he had to type The Lord of the Rings himself because he handwrote it. But his publishers needed a written version to publish, or a typed version to publish. And so Tolkien sat up in his attic, balancing his typewriter on his attic bed, and he typed the entire thing with 2 fingers, very slowly. That, The Lord of the Rings was written in unideal circumstances. Tolkien had to do something he didn't know how to do in order to get it done. You can find excuses, or you can find a way. And sometimes that way is just sheer grit. But if you want to achieve your dreams, it's obviously going to be hard work. Tolkien was asked how he spends his days. And after laughing, he just said, working like hell. A pen is to me as a beak is to a hen. Working like hell is what it takes. And the reason Tolkien was successful is because he put in the work to get really good at what he was doing. So when the opportunity came for The Hobbit, he was able to make the most of it. And then when the next opportunity came after The Hobbit, which was The Lord of the Rings, he was able to make the most of that. If you have unreasonable goals, just understand you're probably going to have to work unreasonably as well. That is what it takes. Working like hell. Tolkien, if you asked him in letters, he described often his time working on Lord of the Rings. And I just wrote down a couple of them. Lots of sweat, painful work, very great labor, most exhausting work. And he goes on and on and on, and constantly addressing how much work The Lord of the Rings is on him. In my outline that I have here, under these like quotes from Tolkien talking about how hard it was or how hard it is writing The Lord of the Rings, I wrote, if you love what you do, you'll never work a day in your life. ... Wrong. If you love what you do, it is going to make the hard work worth it. But hard work is hard work whether you like doing it or not. But if you love what you do, when it does become hard, you're going to find it within you to keep going. If you don't love what you do, if it starts to get hard, it's easy to convince yourself to stop doing it because you don't care. You don't care about this thing. So why would you keep working at it? But if you do care, if you do love it, if you are deeply serious about it, you're going to keep going even when it's hard. This idea that if you love something, you'll never work in your day in your life, I think puts people on the wrong path a lot. Because they have this idea that if I love it, it shouldn't be work, and they're doing something they think they enjoy, but it feels like work to them. And because they feel like work to them, they convince themselves that this is not their passion. This is not the thing they love to do. They have to find the thing that won't feel like work. But passion, at least in my experience, is built out of consistently doing something and getting better at something. Passion develops over time, and we expect to find passion in a moment, and that's not how passion works. You become passionate about something the more time you spend working on it. And that work is going to be work. Even if you are right up to the very end of getting something done, more often than not, like the thing you're working on is going to get harder and harder to work on, harder and harder to complete the closer you get to the end. And it's at that point where and again, maybe at that point you're not going to throw in the towel and like give up. I guess giving up has there's multiple ways of reading giving up. Like when I say giving up, like you might think of like just stopping to do the thing altogether. But in the context of like if you're writing a book or if you're making a movie, if you don't love this thing, the work you're willing to do at the end is not going to be as high as someone who loves it. Because when you get to the end, the better you get, the more work is required. Like if you're making something, if you're making a movie or you're writing a book and it's like a 98 out of 100, the amount of work required to go from 98 to 99 is as much effort as you put in to go from 0 to 98. So not a lot of people are going to have it in them to put in that much effort again just to go 1% more. And so they're going to throw in the towel at that point because they don't care. And truthfully, they probably didn't get to 98 if they didn't care anyways, but just roll with this example. It is the people who love it who are going to put in just as much effort as it took to go from 0 to 98 as it will take them to go from 98 to 99 because they care that much. And so the very end of a project is when you're actually going to have to dig the deepest. Even Tolkien, when they were going to publish, I believe this was Return of the King. Tolkien said, I remember that when it became apparent that the general map would not suffice for the final book or sufficiently reveal the courses of Frodo, the Rohirrim, and Aragorn, I had to devote many days, the last 3 virtually without food or bed, to drawing, rescaling, and adjusting a large map, at which Christopher, his son, then worked for 24 hours from 6 a.m. to 6 a.m. without bed and redrawing it just in time. This period here, there's like 4-day window where Tolkien went almost 72 hours without sleeping, and then Christopher went 24 without sleeping, could potentially be some of the hardest points of ever working on The Lord of the Rings. And it came right at the end. And somebody who wasn't as invested as Tolkien was at this point probably wouldn't have put in as much effort to get the maps redone. They would have done work that was good enough. But because Tolkien loved it and because Christopher loved it, but also cared about his father deeply, they put in work that not everybody would have done at that point. You have to love what you do in order to put in the effort required to make it great. And for Tolkien, for him, he said his work did not evolve into a serious work. It started like that. I'm a philologist, and all of my work is philological. I avoid hobbies because I'm a very serious person and cannot distinguish between private amusement and duty. I am affable but unsociable. I only work for private amusement since I find my duties privately amusing. This is also where I guess I talk about when Tolkien takes it deeply seriously and he cannot distinguish between private amusement and duty. I think somebody who doesn't take what they do seriously, doesn't view what they're working on as a duty, it is just amusing to them, will not have it in them. There's two things here that I'm at, like, this is kind of clicking in my brain at real time here. You obviously need to love what you do in order to put in that work, right? Because someone who doesn't love it won't put in the same work that you would do. But you also have to take it seriously and not view it as just a hobby or something unserious. You need to love it and you need to take it seriously, even if it is considered a quote unquote hobby, because it's not his job. It is something he's doing at night, on weekends, and on vacations. To him, though, it was not a hobby. It was a duty. It is something he had to do and do seriously. That doesn't mean he didn't love to do it. He still loved to do it, but it was a duty to him. And I read that, and this is an articulation of how I feel about this podcast in a way that I've never been able to articulate on my own. This podcast is, some people view it as a hobby, but I've never associated with the word hobby when it came to either this podcast or the one I did before. It was something greater than that. And duty is a word I like a lot because it is something I take seriously, more seriously than a hobby. Because that's just how I'm wired. It's just how I am. I can't take it. If I'm going to devote myself to something like this, I'm not going to do it half-assed. I'm not going to do it leisurely. I get a lot of personal satisfaction from doing this show, and I love doing this. And a lot of it, in the same way that The Lord of the Rings is for Tolkien, a lot of this show is for my own private amusement. A lot of the show is me just watching movies, reading books, doing research, things I love to do. But that doesn't mean I'm just doing it leisurely. This is something I am taking seriously. Your work is something that you should take seriously as well. Now, all of that being said, you do also need to give yourself the grace that this is not how you're making your money. That you have other responsibilities. Because Tolkien, when writing The Lord of the Rings, so part of the reason, yes, it took so long is because he had all these other responsibilities that sometimes would take up a year of time. There were periods where Tolkien would stop working on The Lord of the Rings for over 365 days in a row. Which, to me, it feels like an inconceivable thing to just go an entire year without doing it. But I think that the credit given to him is the fact that he never let it go. No matter how long he stepped away, he always came back to finish. It's easy to start a project. It's much, much harder to finish one. And Tolkien came back and finished this, which was an incredibly difficult task. The Lord of the Rings is 3 books in publication, but was written as 1 book. And so the amount of things, and we talked about how specific Tolkien was with everything in that world, the amount of things he had to keep track of and stay on top of when writing it was immense. This was not an easy book to write. And it would have been easy for him to give up, especially after taking a year off. To come back and try to get back into the story was challenging. He even talked about, I am absolutely dry of any inspiration for the ring and am back where I was in the spring with all the inertia to overcome again. Part of the challenge with when you do take an extended break is not only getting back into the rhythm and getting, picking the skill back up, but it is building up the momentum again. The motivation you have when you're in the middle of a project, or not the motivation, building up the momentum creates a certain type of motivation that you don't have without the momentum. And so even though you might be in the middle of a project and you're tired, you're motivated to get done because you're in it. and you've been doing it consistently. But when you haven't been doing it consistently, you have to not only find your way back into the world, but also you have to build up that momentum again that is going to carry you through the challenging moments. And so breaks will happen, but I encourage you to avoid them as much as you can, because they make it that much harder to get back into it and finish. And the further into a project it is, the harder it is for you to get back into it. And so I think that this is something that Tolkien doesn't get enough credit for. People talk about how long it took him to write The Lord of the Rings, which yes, it took a long time, but the amount of willpower and effort it took him to take a year off and come back into an incredibly complex project and get it to the point that we have it as it is today, wildly, wildly impressive. But what do you do? Like, let's say you did take a long break and you want to get back into a project. Like, how do you start to build up that momentum again? How do you find your way back into the world? And and it's not going to be easy. Like, I'll be upfront. Like, it's obviously a very hard thing to do. Tolkien said, I've started to do some, in brackets, painful work on the chapter which picks up the adventures of Frodo and Sam again. And to get myself attuned, I have been copying and polishing the last written chapter. And I think that's an interesting way of approaching how you get back into a project. It's not revising the whole thing. I think you should reread up to the point where you left off and then revise the last part where you left off. That'll give you enough you'll polish it with fresh eyes, but if the story's not done, you don't want to start revising the entire story, because that is not going to prove beneficial, because the story is going to change so much by the end. You don't want to bring a second draft mentality into an incomplete first draft. So polish up the last thing you worked on. And then, because I think if you can do that, it's going to give you some easy wins to start stacking, to start to slowly build up that momentum. And then you're moving on with the story, because you just do that. Like in Tolkien's case, he just did that last chapter and then he's moving on to continue writing the story. He's not just doing the whole revision and then having to pick up back up. You stack some quick wins by doing some small edits to the most recent thing, and then you start writing again, because that gets you back into the world a little bit, enough to give you the push to keep moving forward. But again, that doesn't always mean it's going to be easy to do. Like, I make it, the way I explain it sounds a little bit reductive, because it's hard. It's just going to be hard. And I think also when you get back into a project, it's going to take you, the amount of work you put in is not going to yield the same output as when you have the momentum. Like Tolkien said, I have seriously embarked on an effort to finish my book and have been sitting up rather late, a lot of rereading and research required. And it is a painful, tricky business getting into swing again. A few pages for a lot of sweat. This is also why getting back into a project after a long break, especially one like The Lord of the Rings, is so impressive, because it is like the inputs will not yield consistent outputs. Like, it is the few pages for a lot of sweat. Like, when you took a break and you come back and you're now in the middle of a complex process or a complex project and you're putting in all of these hours and you're not getting that much out, it's a lot easier to convince yourself to throw in the towel at that point. And so the fact that Tolkien didn't do that as well is, again, just so wildly impressive. But I think this idea of, this is definitely apparent at the beginning, or when you come back into a project after being gone for a while, where like the inputs you are putting in do not yield the same outputs they once did when you were really clicking and you had momentum. But just in art in general, like, consistent inputs do not always yield consistent outputs. And this is something that I struggle with tremendously. As just the way my brain is wired, I want to be able to look at something and be like, if I work on a screenplay for 3 hours, I can write 3 pages an hour. That gives me 9 pages, but I could get to 3.5 in an hour. So I could do 10 pages in 3 hours. And then if I work on a screenplay for 3 hours and I end up with 4 pages, I'm going to be distraught. But that's just the way art works. Art is not, the creative process is not a system to be optimized. I think if it is a system to be optimized, then there are going to be there's benefits. I'm thinking through this. This is one of those points where I try to be as like buttoned up on these episodes as I can, but then there's certain points I stumble onto where I'm like, do I believe that? I think there are certain elements of the creative process that can be systemized and can be turned into a routine. But the problem is like the creative process can be messy and slow. And there are obstacles in the creative process you can't necessarily predict that can slow you down. And I just struggle with this idea. Like a few pages for a lot of sweat is something that I personally struggle with when I know that I've done the similar work for a lot more than a few pages. And so this is just something to think about as you go through it, is like there's no like polished takeaway I have for you here with this point, but it is just the idea that with art, there's going to be times where you're putting in the work and nothing is happening, or it's moving really slowly. And that, I think, is also an important time not to give up. Do not give. I think it is going to be that much harder if you are stuck and struggling and you quit then. It's going to make it that much harder for you to come back and pick things up when you do come back after a break. I think part of the reason that I do struggle with that so much, this idea of this output or this input should lead to this output, which results in this thing, and that's not how art works, that's not how life works, is I put this pressure on myself to make it, quote unquote, like to figure it out. I'm 28 years old. I have achieved some small things in my life, but like none of the things I initially thought I was going to achieve in this decade of my life. I am relatively unknown. Not relatively, I am unknown. And I think there's just this expectation I put on myself to have a certain success as a creative person that I have not achieved. And so part of the struggle or the frustration when the inputs do not always yield consistent outputs is like, I don't have the time to not have the outputs be as great as they could be. And it's a stressful thing to have to put these expectations on yourself. And it's something that I definitely deal with, something I definitely struggle with. But I think that the reminder here, especially looking at the life of somebody like Tolkien, is that just because you're a failure right now, and I don't want to use the word failure, that's not fair to me or to you. I think a better way to put it is, if you don't make it right now, that doesn't mean you won't make it forever. Like looking at Tolkien as the example, he didn't publish The Lord of the Rings until he was in his 60s. And so I'm 28 and I'm like, I haven't made it yet. Am I a failure? Like, have I wasted this opportunity? But I think we have this obsession of making it when we're young, which is detrimental in a sense. Like, there's a couple of readings of this. Is like, we have this obsession of making it when we're young, so we'd be more apt to take the shortcut to make it. But in taking the shortcut, we make compromises that don't make making it sustainable. Like, I've been thinking a lot about this idea of how far do you want to make it? Because people, when they're young, just want to have success. They want to be that person. They want to be recognized. They want to be known. They want to be famous. And they'll do whatever they have to get there. But what people don't think about is like, how long do you want to be there for? Like, how far do you want to make it? Like, how long do you want to stick around? And so I think there are some advantages to taking your time to be successful, to make it, because you'll just have learned enough to be able to stick around. And I think sometimes with our obsession with making it, it can lead to us taking shortcuts to get there. And the thing with the shortcut is the shortcut comes to the end the fastest. And so when you think about how far do you want to make it, the shortcut's actually the wrong way. But I also want to make sure that, like, in doing that, we get so focused on the output or the outcome, we stop thinking about what we're putting in. Like, we stop thinking about the input. Like, we becomes less about the work and more about the outcome. And that's not how Tolkien treated it. For him, it was always about the work first. And I never want to, as much as like the insecurities come in of like, I'm 28 years old, I haven't made it yet. I never want to compromise what it is that I do in order to get there. I have to make sure that I prioritize the work, and the product that I am putting out into the world is something that I am proud of. And sometimes taking the long way is the right way, as hard as it is. It took Tolkien until his 60s to publish The Lord of the Rings. And again, that doesn't mean that insecurities won't come in and doubt won't seep into what it is that you're doing. Like I'm telling you, I'm experiencing this all the time. I'm looking at you right now, and I'm telling you that I both think that I should take it slowly. I don't want to take the shortcut because I want to make sure that when I do get that opportunity, I can make the most of it and I can stick around. I'm telling you that is my intention. I want to build the back catalog so when people discover me, there's enough work here for them to have like enough to binge, to become fans. Because I believe that your diehard fans are made in the catalog. But I'm telling you that all this, I want to take it slowly. I understand, but the doubt still seeps in. I tell you this now, and I'm going to go to bed tonight. I'm like, man, but I'm 28. I've been doing the show for a couple of years, and I'm no further along than I was when I started it. And even for Tolkien, right? Like, again, this literary giant, he created The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and The Silmarillion. And even for him, there was doubt. His biographer, Humphrey Carpenter, wrote that he was 51, tired and fearful that in the end, he would achieve nothing. He had already gained a reputation for almost indefinite procrastination in his philological work, and this sometimes amused him, though was often saddening to him. But as to never finishing his mythology, that was a dreadful and numbing thought. Tolkien, again, is one of the greats, and he had doubts. He was worried about his lack of he was worried that he hadn't made it. And so these feelings that you and I have are normal. But there's also something in that quote that I think is really interesting. And it's never finishing his mythology. That was a dreadful and numbing thought. Which is interesting because the reason that Tolkien wanted to finish his mythology was so that he could share it with the world. He wanted to have an audience. He wanted people to consume his work. Yes, he was doing it for himself and he was getting satisfaction and enjoyment out of doing it. But if he never got to a place where it could be shared with others, to him that would be a failure. It was a dreadful and numbing thought. One of my staunchly held beliefs that I have developed doing this show is that your art is not for you. It is for the audience. You are making things for people to consume them. JRR Tolkien wanted to have an audience. And that's okay to admit. Tolkien himself even admitted that. During the process of writing The Lord of the Rings, he said, "The thing is to finish the thing as devised and then let it be judged. But forgive me, it is written in my lifeblood, such as that is thick or thin, and I can no other. I fear it must stand or fall as it substantially is. It would be idle to pretend that I do not greatly desire publication, since a solitary art is no art. Nor that I have not a pleasure in praise with as little vanity as fallen man can manage. Yet the chief thing is to complete one's work as far as completion has any real sense." There is a lot in this quote. The chief thing is to complete one's work. The goal is for you to finish it. Like we talked about perfection, and Tolkien is a perfectionist. He wasn't doing it for self-enjoyment. He had the expectation of getting the work out there. He was not doing it self-indulgently. That's the word I'm looking for. It was not self-indulgence. He knew that the purpose of doing all this work was to get it out into the world, because art is meant to be seen. A solitary art is not art. Art has to be shared with other people. It is meant to be judged. People will judge it. But that's a scary thing, right? Like Tolkien said, he wrote The Lord of the Rings in his lifeblood. which is how you should be. We talked about this with Joni Mitchell. She had a teacher when she was very early on who quoted Nietzsche to her, said, you have to write in your own blood. You have to write about the things that you care about, the things that mean a lot to you. And that's scary. It's scary to put your heart and soul into something and then give it to the world to judge it. Because there's a chance the world doesn't like it. And if the world doesn't like it, what does that say about you, the person who wrote it, the person whose lifeblood gave birth to this thing? And so that is why a lot of people will say, my art is for me. I don't care if people see it, because it's a defense mechanism. They might not they want people to see it, but they don't want people to judge it. And so saying your work is just for you is just an excuse for when people don't inevitably consume it. But again, people get this confused when I say that your art is for the audience. Your art is for the audience. It is not made because of the audience. Your work, your art needs to start with you, but it is going to end with the audience. So what that means is you are going to write this story. You're going to make this movie. You're going to write this song in your lifeblood. You're going to write it in your own blood. It is going to come from you. It is going to be a part of you. You're going to take a piece of your soul and put it into that thing with the expectation of sharing with the world to change the people who consume it. Art done well has the power to change the world by changing the people who change the world. And it only happens if you put your soul into your work, because people will take your soul and make it a part of their own. And that only happens if it starts with you. It does not start with what does the audience want? Let me give the audience that. I do not agree with that. And that is not what I'm saying here. But I'm saying is you're going to make this thing with the expectation of people seeing it. And so then therefore you should make some decisions or consider the audience in the creation process. And in a letter Tolkien wrote, I found the greatest example of why that is. Tolkien wrote, if I had considered my own pleasure more than the stomachs of a possible audience, there would have been a great deal more elvish in the book. If JRR Tolkien had had his way, most of the Lord of the Rings would have been written in a language that he invented that nobody else knew. If it had been written purely just for him, that's what we would have gotten. That would have been the outcome. We wouldn't be talking about J.R.R. Tolkien today if that was the case. It would not have taken off in the same way. But because Tolkien was making this thing for himself and he wanted to share it with others, he had to present it in a way that those people could consume it, could find a way into his world. He made decisions with the audience in mind, but the story was written for him. It was inspired by all of the things that he learned. He was making a story that he wanted to see in the world, but he wanted the world to see it as well. And so he made decisions to make sure that they would be comfortable receiving it. And Tolkien eventually got his wish. The Lord of the Rings was finally completed after a 5-year publishing dispute where he tried to get out of his agreement with Allen and Unwin to go to a different publisher who was also going to publish his book, The Silmarillion. That ultimately then fell through and he went back to Allen and Unwin. The Lord of the Rings was finally published and it became a huge success. It became massive in England. It became even bigger in the United States. I think the reason it became so popular in the United States is really interesting. And we're going to talk about that actually in the bonus content episode, which is an audio exclusive on your podcast app. But The Lord of the Rings was seen by many, many people, millions and millions of people, probably more people than Tolkien could have ever imagined. But what came alongside that was fame. And I think that's a really interesting distinction, right? Like Tolkien wanted people to see his work, but he didn't necessarily want to be seen himself. Like he wanted his work to have an audience, but he didn't want to be famous. And he found fame more cumbersome than anything. He spent a lot of his time following the success of the Lord of the Rings, replying to letters. He felt this like duty to his audience to correspond with them, especially if it was children or the elderly. He would set time aside to reply to them. But there's a lot of other things that came with it. He had random visitors to his house, people constantly wanting to interview him. It was a lot for him. Humphrey wrote that fame puzzled him. It was not something that he had ever expected or felt to be appropriate. Certainly let his readers be enthusiastic about the stories, but why should they make a fuss of him? And they were indeed making a fuss. He was having to deal with a huge amount of correspondence from fans, and many readers did not merely send him letters. They enclosed gifts of every kind: paintings, sculptures, drinking goblets, photographs of themselves dressed as characters from the books, tape recordings, food, drink, tobacco, and tapestries. 76 Sandfield Road, where the Tolkiens were now living, was already filled to bursting with books and papers and now began to overflow with gifts. Tolkien spent day after day writing letters of thanks. When Alan and Unwin offered to assist him with answering of his fan mail, he accepted with gratitude. But since his private address had received some publicity and his telephone number could be found in the Oxford directory, he was troubled in another way. Callers began to arrive without appointment, asking him to autograph books or to give them money. Usually they were polite, occasionally mad or threatening. The telephone would ring in the middle of the night. An unknown American was on the line wishing to speak to Tolkien in person and quite unaware of the time difference. Worst of all, people began to take photographs through the windows. It was not the kind of thing that should happen in an ordered world, a scoured shire. And when I read that, I was like, the more you think about fame, the less it really makes sense. Like, I think the ideal is to have people view your work, to appreciate your work, to have the financial successes that come with the work, but none of the headache of fame. I record these podcasts on video, and I often go back and forth as to whether or not I actually want to do that. Like, should I actually make the decision to remove my face? You can't really remove it from the internet, but to not associate the podcast with me, just to associate it with the podcast. I don't know, because I still have that thing in me where it's no, but I want people to appreciate me because it's my work. And truthfully, I don't think that, and maybe I'm wrong, but I think the way I'm going to navigate art well is I never want it to become so big that I can't live the life I want to live. I think the ideal is kind of what some of these podcasters have, Tim Ferriss is kind of one where it's he's mentioned where it's he's famous enough where if he goes to a place where he knows his fans will be, he gets the attention and all the benefits of being famous, but he can also go to the grocery store and probably won't get recognized. I think that's probably the sweet spot. But becoming ultra mega famous has its drawbacks, and it doesn't really feel like fame is, it feels like the pros of fame are far outweighed by the cons. I would much rather be known and respected by the influential people that are famous than be the famous person myself, I think. And I was listening to this podcast recently. There's this artist I really like. His name is John Bellion. And he was giving an interview. He said, why do you think every artist ever goes on a podcast over and over? And it's the same story. I was at the height of my career and the loneliest I've ever been. It's at a certain point, I might be mildly not too dumb to look at that and just be I'm going to believe all of them and never look over the fence and never chase after the thing that, no, I got it. Because enough people have told me that it's not the end all be all. Fame is not what you think it is. And Tolkien, even to prove how much Tolkien didn't want fame, because it's one thing for him to be I just wanted people to see my books, I didn't want to become famous, is to actually look at how he acted following becoming famous. Instead of a quiet retirement, Tolkien found to his amazement that his books had brought him enormous success and fame. He was overwhelmed in a sense by fame because it distracted him, and he was too easily distracted perhaps. He did have a few luxuries which fame gave him when the money began to flow. He took taxis, for instance, but outwardly he was the same man, living in the same modest way, absolutely unspoiled, and this was very, very attractive to those who came to see him as I did. He was not the grand man, too famous to give him more than a quarter of an hour. He was the same professor, talking, interested in whatever happened to me at the moment, on the top of the agenda, making his jokes, striking matches, lighting his pipe, and roaring with laughter. He was a good friend. He was very much what one imagines an Oxford Don to look like when I knew him. And there's a lesson in this. I think I find it hilarious that one of the few luxuries that Tolkien got was he took taxis instead of biking places. But by and large, he didn't really change his life, himself. He was just the same guy. And I think the lesson here is how can you create the life you want now that wouldn't change if you became famous? I think we put so much expectation on the outcome, right? Like I want to become successful, I want to become famous, I want people to view my work so that I can do all of these things. But I think a fun thought exercise is to put yourself through is like, how can I create the life now that if I became famous, I wouldn't want to change it? Because by doing so, you can still reap some of the benefits, of course, like taking taxis maybe, but you can keep yourself. The way I think about this is like, to bring back John Bellion, is he was talking about how like, if he wants to be rich forever, he just has to live below his means. And I think part of below his means of being rich. And if he lives below his means, he'll be rich forever. Versus if he's trying to live the lifestyle of somebody who is rich and famous, he's going to be on that treadmill and have to do things in order to maintain that image forever. Versus he's had the success now, he can, as long as what they are spending is below the current means, he doesn't need to do anything to keep up with his image. And so the thought exercise is like, how can you create a life now that if you became famous, you wouldn't want to change? And if you've done that, I think you've won. And in Tolkien's case, when he became famous and successful, he didn't change his life that much. He definitely lived below his means. He didn't even stop working, actually. Like, once the Lord of the Rings became so successful, Allen and Unwin said they were interested in finally publishing the Silmarillion. And again, the Silmarillion was the book that Tolkien initially set out to write. Like when he developed Quenya in the 1910s and started to write a mythology around it, that mythology was the Silmarillion. The only thing is that the Silmarillion was never finished. And so he had to turn it into something that was publishable. But the challenge with the Silmarillion is he started writing it before The Hobbit, and he stopped writing it, or at least not focusing on as much when he was writing The Hobbit. The Hobbit initially was not a part of the Silmarillion mythology. But then when he started writing the sequel to The Hobbit, which became The Lord of the Rings, because it grew and grew and grew in scope, eventually became a part of the mythology that Tolkien had started writing originally, which meant that The Hobbit then had to be retrofitted to fit into this mythology as well. So when Tolkien is sitting down, finally, in his 60s to try and take the Silmarillion and turn it into something that could be published, he's having to make so many changes because he's having to find a way to make sure that the Lord of the Rings fits in it and everything is consistent that is said in Lord of the Rings, that is said in the Silmarillion, that also factors in everything that happened in The Hobbit. And it just became this ever-growing, complex work that he had to do. And ultimately, he never published it in his lifetime. He passed away before it was ever completed. Ultimately did come out. His son Christopher ended up taking the Silmarillion and editing it and publishing it on behalf of his father. And Christopher, when talking about the fact that his father never completed the Silmarillion, said this: the Lord of the Rings would in turn begin to develop new stories within the Silmarillion. I think the whole thing simply became too large and too complex. As perhaps a task for a younger man, the flame began to die down, and he hadn't the energy left that would be needed for such a huge transformation. Some people who knew him well thought that he didn't really want to finish the Silmarillion, suggesting that at some level he felt that to finish the Silmarillion would be finishing his life. I personally don't think that at all. I don't think that there's any real evidence for it. I think he deeply wanted to finish it, but it was too large a task. Tolkien viewed the Silmarillion as his chief literary ambition. He viewed the Lord of the Rings as his magnum opus, but the real thing he wanted to have in the world was the Silmarillion. It is what he'd been trying to publish for decades, and he finally got the opportunity, and he couldn't get it to a place that it could be published. And it's a real gut punch to hear kind of what his state of mind was like closer to the end of his life while he's trying to finish this thing again, which he viewed as his chief literary ambition. This is an amalgamation of a couple of quotes, but this gives you like a picture of kind of Tolkien's approach and his mindset as he's trying to get this book finished. Sometimes he would put in long hours at his desk, but on other days, he would soon turn to a game of patience and abandon any pretense of working. They could wait for the book. He would take his time. Yet on other days, he was distressed that time was leaking away so fast with the book still unfinished. He was saddened by the consciousness of waning powers and wrote in 1965, "I find it difficult to work, beginning to feel old and the fire dying down." That last line, that's the gut punch. Like, the clock is ticking, always. And your time frame of work is shorter than we think it is. Like, you think you're going to live to 80 to 90 to 100. That's true, but your powers as a human being aren't going to be as great as you get older and older and older. You're going to get tired more easily. You're not going to be able to put in the time you're doing now. And so your window of time, life's long, but life's also short. And it's saddening to me to know that Tolkien wanted to work, but he didn't have it in him to get it done. This thing he'd spent his entire life working towards, he finally got the chance, but it was a little bit too late for him to get it done. This is something that just sticks with me. And doing these episodes is a bit weird because I go through someone's entire life truncated down to like a couple of weeks. And like, I started this by learning about Tolkien growing up in South Africa, and I end here with him. Like, I just see like the whole story laid out in such a truncated timeline. And I always get to the end of someone's life, and it's always this reminder that like the clock's always ticking. You're never going to get the opportunity to put everything out into the world that you want to put out into the world. So prioritize what you work on and make sure you get it across the finish line, and appreciate the fact that you get to work on it, because the amount of chances you actually get is far, far fewer than you think it will be. Now, all that being said, while Tolkien never did publish the Silmarillion in his lifetime, he did publish The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, two masterpieces that achieved what he set out to do. They found audiences, granted a much bigger audience than he ever could have imagined, but an audience for his mythology, an audience that deeply resonated with it. And while he never lived long enough to see these two books become classics, because if you asked him, the idea of a living man publishing a classic made no sense, or 70 years later, The Lord of the Rings are just as relevant today as they were back then. I think it's safe to say that they have become classics. Thank you so much for listening to my deep dive into JRR Tolkien. If you haven't yet, make sure you go and subscribe to the Artwell podcast. I'm going to be putting out an audio exclusive episode of all of the material that I cut from the deep dive. I was just looking at the bonus content episode document. It's 15 pages long. The outline document for the deep dive was 18 pages. That means there's almost as much information that I cut from the deep dive as made it into the deep dive. And so if you want to hear about all of that, make sure you subscribe to the Artwell podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, do me a favor and send it to just one friend who you think would like it too. And if you liked it enough that you want to go and listen to even more Artwell, I have a challenge for you. Go and listen to an episode of an artist you've either never heard of or know very little about. My belief is that the only way Artwell works is if you can listen to any episode and still get value from it. So if you do that, I'd love to have your feedback on what you took away from that episode. And now, go do your thing. And whatever it is, do it well. You still there? If you are, that means you made it to the special features. The special features is something fun that I like to do at the end of every deep dive, where I give you my commentary on the art in some way. And what I thought would be fun to do today would be to read you my favorite quotes from The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And for The Hobbit, I only have one quote. And the reason for that is because I read a physical copy of The Hobbit, whereas when I read The Lord of the Rings, I read it on a Kindle version. And so if I wanted to take a highlight for The Hobbit, what I would have to do is I'd have to stop reading and I'd have to get up, grab my phone in the other room, take a picture of the book, of the quote I wanted, highlight it in my text or my picture to text app, and then send it to my Readwise, which sends it to my Notion, which I use to build the outline. And so I only took one highlight from The Hobbit for that reason, but it was such a good quote that I thought it was worthy of getting up to get my phone to do this. And the quote is, "Now goblins are cruel, wicked, and bad-hearted. They make no beautiful things, but they make many clever ones." And the reason I got up to get my phone to record this highlight was because I felt that was such a great summation of where we are in the world right now in terms of the things that we are making, especially like artistically. I've talked about it on the past in the show, but I come from like a YouTube background. I used to interview a lot of YouTubers, and the show I actually got flown out to LA for was to interview YouTubers. And I eventually kind of sort of left that world in a way, partially of like, just didn't get a job in it, got a job somewhere else, partially because like I was getting frustrated with that world, and which is a large reason why Artwell is the show I'm doing now. But like the idea of making beautiful things, but making clever ones, to me spoke to me in a way of like, oh, this is like, we're making everything based off of like algorithms and data, and we're giving people exactly what they want. We're not worried about beauty anymore in the things that we are making. We are just looking about clever enough, like enough to keep somebody from scrolling away. That's all we care about in today's world. We don't actually care about beauty. Like the YouTube meta aesthetic isn't a pretty art form. It's not beautiful. It is engineered and designed to make sure your audience watches as long as possible. It's very clever. It is very clever, but it is not beautiful. And this line in The Hobbit articulated that in a way to me that nothing ever has before, when I talk about like how YouTube is just like so like retention, like these cracked out candy style videos to make sure you don't scroll away. But this articulation that Tolkien had in The Hobbit 90 years ago almost is far better than anything that I've ever come up with. Now, all of my quotes from The Lord of the Rings, I don't really, like I just kind of copy and pasted them from my highlights. So I don't actually have as much of a thought on all of these. I'll be reacting to them kind of in real time. We'll start with this one. Now, at any rate, he is as bad as an orc and just an enemy. He deserves death. Deserves it, I dare say he does. Many that live deserve death, and some that die deserve life. Can you give it to them? Then do not be eager to deal out death in judgment. That's just fire. I think that's just a good quote. The next one. We could save a quarter of the distance if we made a line for the ferry from where we stand. Shortcuts make long delays, argued Pippin. The part that I bolded here was shortcuts make long delays. That's similarly to kind of, it's different from my reading on shortcuts. Like shortcuts come to the end of the fastest, meaning like you might reach the destination you want to, but it's going to come to an end. Like you're not going to be able to stick around because you took the shortcut. But shortcuts make long delays is also a fun reading on shortcuts, because the shortcut never actually works out as simply as it's supposed to, which ultimately will create more headache, which means it'll end up taking you longer than if you'd just taken the direct path. It's also like when I say shortcuts come to an end the fastest, is like where you're trying to get to, you might get faster part of the way, but then you have to figure out you have to backtrack and take another shortcut, and shortcuts make long delays. This next one I highlighted because I've seen this quote all over the internet, and I didn't realize this was a quote of JRR Tolkien's in The Lord of the Rings. Not all those who wander are lost. Like I'm sure you've seen that under somebody with a wanderlust tattoo. But I had no idea that was a JRR Tolkien quote. The old Entish, as you might say, it is a lovely language, but it takes a very long time to say anything in it, because we do not say anything in it unless it is worth taking a long time to say and to listen. We do not say anything unless it is worth taking a long time to say. Really what this is like just saying, think through what you have to say before you say it. And I think in today's world, we're often we want to have opinions, oftentimes just for the sake of having an opinion. And I grew up very much as somebody without many opinions. I still am very much that way, where I am unopinionated in a lot of ways. Part of that is like a byproduct of like being a people pleaser growing up. And you please people by not having opinions that will piss them off. But I also I'm only going to have opinions on things I care enough about. And I think people get worked up about things and create opinions for the sake of having an opinion, and they haven't put into the work to think through why they have that opinion. I think it's Mark Andreessen, who's a famous venture capitalist, who has this saying of like, you shouldn't hold an opinion unless you can argue the other side better than for your own opinion. Like, meaning you should really have thought through this whole thing. You should thought out all the other sides before you hold a genuine opinion. And that to me is kind of what this quote is saying. We do not say anything unless it is worth taking a long time to say. More haste, this next quote is just 4 words. More haste, less speed. More haste, less speed. When I wrote down in brackets next, I was like intention versus activity. And I think haste is moving with a purpose, whereas speed is just moving for the sake of movement. It's movement versus progress in a way. Like you can run in place and you can do it really fast and you can work really hard, but you're not actually going anywhere. Haste, on the other hand, feels like it's speed with intention. And I just like that one was good. This next one's the longest one I highlighted. And we shouldn't be here at all if we'd known more about it before we started, but I suppose it's often that way. The brave things in the old tales and songs, Mr. Frodo, adventures as I used to call them. I used to think that they were things that wonderful folk of the stories went out and looked for because they wanted them, because they were exciting and life was a bit dull, a kind of sport, as you might say. But that's not the way of it with the tales that really mattered or the ones that stay in the mind. Folks seem to have been just landed in them. Usually their paths were laid that way, as you put it. But I expect they had lots of chances like us of turning back. Only they didn't. And if they had, we shouldn't know because they'd have been forgotten. We hear about those as just went on, and not all to a good end, mind you. At least not to what folk inside a story and not outside it call a good end. That's Sam Gamgee. And I loved this passage. I remember reading it. And I think what I love about it is this idea of, one, the stories we tell are those who don't turn back, the ones who don't quit. Even if they fail, we'll still tell their story. But no one remembers the person who quit. I think that's a really interesting notion. Also, the idea of the greatest adventures in life are going to be the ones you do not plan for. There are the people who go and seek out adventure, but you can't, let me put it this way. I don't go out ever. Part of the reason is now dark, as you can see, and I am still here recording the podcast if you're watching the video version. But a night out that is amazing, that was unplanned, is incredible. But if the following weekend, you're like, hey, last weekend we had this amazing, amazing time out, like this happened and this happened, we went here and we went here. If you, the following weekend, planned that night out again, and you, with the intention of going to all of the same places you had gone to the previous weekend, it wouldn't be the same. It is in the unexpected plan that a crazy adventure you plan for is never the same as a crazy adventure that happens when you don't plan for it. That was my other takeaway from this. This next one is Aragorn. The hasty stroke goes oft astray. And when I highlighted that one, it made me think, I think it's Tony Robbins, not to get super self-helpy, but it's like, there's this thing where it's like, if a plane is 3 degrees off on its trajectory going across the ocean, like if you're trying to go from New York to England, if you're just 3 degrees off from the beginning, that will compound over time to get you way wide of your mark. And so taking the time in the beginning to be properly oriented pays dividends in the long run. I think there's obviously a balancing act of taking action and planning, because planning can just be delaying, but there's also something to be said for, as Aragorn says here, taking hasty action, which will actually lead to more work that you have to do down the line. And so it's a balancing act. Obviously you can't plan forever, but you also kind of just shooting from the hip with no plan can also just lead to so much work that you have to undo in order to actually correct course. What do you fear, lady? He asked. A cage, she said. To stay behind bars until use and old age accept them, and all chance of doing great deeds is gone beyond recall or desire. This resonates, right? Like a cage, and I think in your case or my case, a cage might be golden handcuffs. Like a cage is something that prevents you from doing the things you want, from doing great deeds. And I think the idea of I think really what this line is interesting to me is this is an acknowledgement of the cage before you realize it. And I think for a lot of people, the cage that you're in, whether it is golden handcuffs, so it's a job, it's a relationship, whatever it might be, you don't realize what that cage is until you've reached the age where you are too old or you reach old age and you are past the point where you can do those great deeds. I think that this line is cool because it is an acknowledgement of that cage from a character who's young and for the reader who is hopefully young that reads that as well. Let us remember that a traitor may betray himself and do good that he does not intend. It can be so sometimes. I think that's a fun one. I don't have a lot, but that's just a fun one. Let us remember that a traitor may betray himself and do good that he does not intend. It can be so sometimes. Last quote I have here is from Frodo. He said, "But I have been too deeply hurt, Sam. I tried to save the Shire and it has been saved, but not for me. It must often be so, Sam. When things are in danger, someone has to give them up, lose them, so that others may keep them." To do a good deed requires sacrifice of some kind. To raise a family, to grow a business, to grow a podcast, to make art requires sacrifice. And I think sometimes that can be lost in this is like the sacrifice that those people make in order to do the things that they have done. To be a great parent requires sacrifice. And I think that is an admirable thing. And maybe it's just the age at which I am, but I'm seeing a lot and thinking a lot about the idea and importance of building a family, a business. Like I work at a very fast growing tech startup. Like I see the sacrifices and the work people make to make that thing happen. I am doing this show. I'm making the sacrifices. I'm giving things up to build this show, which will hopefully benefit you, but also, of course, like I'm doing it to benefit myself as well. But like, I just think that, I don't know if I'm reading this quote in the right way, because Frodo's talking about being too deeply hurt. But my read on that was this idea of the sacrifice that is made by people to bring good to others so often goes unrecognized, even if they are successful. But those are the quotes, the highlights that I made from The Lord of the Rings. I hope you enjoyed them. If you haven't read The Lord of the Rings yet, I highly encourage you to go and do so. I definitely think you should start with The Hobbit. It's worthwhile. And then get into The Lord of the Rings. They were fantastic. I would love to read the Silmarillion soon, just for the sake of time. Like I can't be too self-indulgent with the show if I want to be somewhat consistent with it. But I do at some point intend on doing another episode on Tolkien. This time I had a very much like a Humphrey Carpenter slant. I read his 2 books on Tolkien. There's another book he wrote about the Inklings specifically, which I'd like to read at some point. But there's also another Tolkien book I was looking at reading by a guy named Tom Shippey. And then I learned that Tom also wrote a biography on Tolkien. The other book I read was like an analysis of the making of the process of Lord of the Rings. And he also did an audio documentary with the BBC. So it's like at some point down the line, probably years from now, I'd like to do another Tolkien episode and do like the Tom Shippey side of things. But anyways, this has been my deep dive into JRR Tolkien. Thank you so much for listening. And now, go do your thing. Whatever it is, do it well.